Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is a long time coming. Wayne actually passed this story, the second series, over to me a good 3, maybe 4 months ago, and I had actually planned to hit it in one recording and put it out as one video, but as you know, it's been nothing but technical issues after technical issues along the way. Of course, as ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled The Feline Factor 2, The Horned Skull. Let's get straight into that. About 6 months into my long exile, I finally remembered what Hild had said about the false bottom of my suitcase. Checking it, I was pleasantly surprised to find a very nice laptop and a set of CDs with a whole plethora of information I was going to need. That got sealed in a solid steel block in the basement. The only way to get to it was the use of my gift. After the incident with Lucy, life in Colonial Bay settled down for a while. I sat the exams that Mr. Babcock had set up for me, and I was able to enroll in Midvale College in the fall. I decided on a double major in archaeology and engineering, and a minor in business. It didn't help my reputation on campus much. I was known as a grind, but I had things to do. I wasn't going to let my lady down. College life was actually sort of relaxing, a break for me. I enjoyed just concentrating and learning and staying fit for whatever was going to get thrown at me. In spite of my grades, my friendship with the gang grew, and even Joe Drew and I got closer, actually becoming friends. It really didn't take me that long to settle into a Model A lifestyle. I made several investments along the same lines as my dad had suggested. In the almost 2 years before the stock market crash, I used my gift from Freya to build up quite a stash of gold. If anyone asked, it came out of several dummy mines I owned out west. And come September of the next year, I cashed in all of my risky stocks on gold certificates. After October 29th, 1929, 2 days before my 19th birthday, I became one of the wealthiest men in America. That was a secret that was kept between me, Mr. Babcock, and the IRS. I don't think even Jimmy knew. It just wasn't a good idea to go around advertising that dude made a fortune off the stock market crash. In 1931, the whole gang and I spent 2 hours in the local theatre watching Bela Lugosi bring Bram Stoker's most famous character to life on the silver screen. Afterward, we had a late dinner and talked about it. The general conclusion was that the movie was very scary, but the real thing was even scarier. At that idea, I smiled to myself and thought that they should watch something like Fright Night or The Lost Boys. By June of 1932, I had graduated with a Bachelor's of Science from Midvale Polytechnic. Most of the gang had already finished their degrees and had moved on to begin their careers. Although the Depression was in full swing and jobs were as rare as hen's teeth, so were college degrees, and that little piece of sheepskin could open a lot of doors. George and Betty were engaged and planning to marry as soon as this fall. Betty was working in the secretarial pool for a law firm in DC, and George was a geologist and surveyor for the local company. It kept him busy, but paid pretty well, for the Depression, that is. Dot and Eddie were a regular couple, but right now just dating. Both of them had careers to start, Eddie in mechanical engineering and Dot was going on to medical school. The latter was causing quite a stir among the local population. Female doctors were not the normal in 1932. Jimmy was working as a junior architect for a firm that had a contract with the same company that had erected the Empire State Building. And Long John had become a minister considering his exposure to Lucy, I could have really fought him there. We all began to drift apart until tragedy brought us back together right after my graduation that May. Jimmy had committed suicide. He'd hung himself in his apartment in DC. Well, there was no note, no explanation, no anything. His dad had found him hanging there after he'd been out of contact for a few days. It was at the funeral that we all started to reconnect. By this time, although I was technically the youngest, they all sort of looked up to me as someone that they could go to for help. I remember the funeral well. 2 things stood out. The first is that my mother was right about Christian funerals. Without fail, the minister always goes trolling for souls. It seems that they can't do their job of comforting the afflicted without afflicting the comfortable. The second was that it was a bright and cheerful June day, a sharp contrast to the sadness in our souls. After paying our respects to Mr. Babcock, we gathered at my house for a light dinner and simply talk and reconnect. As we sat down in the parlour for a bit of what ails ye, as Mrs. McCain would say, Jimmy's death was a weight heavy on all of us. Prohibition hadn't been repealed yet, but I knew it was right around the corner. All of us were well of age and I really didn't care about the law in my own home. Sipping some good Irish whiskey my mum had given me for my last birthday. Eddie looked over his glass and asked, "Who was the last person to talk to Jimmy?" And Betty put her drink down and said, "I think I was. It was about 2 weeks ago. We had lunch in DC and he was talking about someone he'd met." I raised an eyebrow. "Really?" I turned to George and asked, "You've always sort of been the one who everybody tells things to. Did he say anything about a new lady in his life to you?" I could see where George was uncomfortable. "He told me about the same thing. We talked a little bit about it. He was afraid to tell his father." "Really?" I asked. "Did he say why?" George shook his head and said, "No." George was a terrible liar, and I could see right through that one. I wasn't going to press him now. George tended to keep other people's secrets out of respect for their privacy. He also was exercising a very good policy of not speaking ill of the dead. I simply nodded and looked at Dot and asked, "How's school?" She smiled and replied, "Actually, that's pretty tough. There's a lot of work involved." I nodded as I knew she had been having difficulty, whereas I and Eddie were proud of her as she ploughed ahead in a field in which she was eminently qualified. A lot of her male colleagues saw her as a threat, and she was. Dot consistently outperformed the male students around her. "Good," I told her. When she gave me a surprised look, I said, "That will make it that much sweeter when you hang up that sign that says Doctor on it." And she grinned at me and said, "You're a queer duck. You know that, Win?" I just smiled and said, "Quack." We spent a great deal of time just talking and catching up on things. Long John had lucked out and took the job as a pastor at one of the local churches. A couple of good recommendations from the town leaders helped with that, even though he was very young. Still, it was the Depression, and it was a poor neighborhood, so to take off some of the pressure of the congregation to pay his salary, he also worked a small farm next to the parsonage. Eddie was making good progress as a mechanical engineer. I was able to surreptitiously slip him a few hints on where to take some of his ideas, and he ran with them. I suspected the only thing that was holding him back from further advancement at this point was his age. Oh well, some things were hard to overcome when a quarter of the country was out of work. As we talked into the evening, I was surprised when Mr. Babcock showed up at my door. I, of course, asked him in and again offered my condolences. He looked past me into the parlour and I knew he saw all of Jimmy's friends talking. He smiled wanly at that and said, "I hate to bother you, Win, but I've come to ask a favour." "Anything," I told him, and meant it. Again, he looked into the parlour and asked, Can I talk to you alone?" I nodded and said, "Of course." I led him to the study where we sat and talked for the first time in over 4 years. The main difference was that the room was now a place that was my own and not a place I'd just inherited. There were little changes that told even the most casual of observers that this was a man's house, absent of a wife. Most of the dollies were gone and were replaced with small cork mats. The lace curtains had been replaced with heavier drapes and wood Venetian blinds. There were no pictures of family. They would be too hard to explain. The head of a large boar I'd killed on a hunting trip to Alfheim decorated the north wall. He smiled as he entered the room and took the seat I offered, saying, "Thank you. This is a difficult time for me, and to be honest, I don't know who else to turn to." I raised an eyebrow and went to the cupboard and pulled down 2 glasses and a bottle of scotch, the good stuff, and poured us both a drink. He smiled and took the glass of amber liquid and sipped it. "How can I help?" I asked. He sighed and took a moment to gather his thoughts. I could see the indecision in his eyes, and finally he said, "I'm not so sure that Jimmy's death was a suicide." "What makes you say that?" I asked. I wanted to hear what he had to say. Lately Jimmy had been hanging around with a bad crowd," Mr. Babcock said. "A bad crowd?" I asked. "Gangsters?" This was after all the age of bathtub gin and Capone had just been convicted. He shook his head and said, "No, Jimmy had more sense than that. I'm talking about those mystics and theosophists. They were a bunch of occultists who were filling his head with strange ideas about near-death experiences and higher planes of existence." "Do you think that Jimmy maybe died while trying to have one of those near-death experiences?" I asked. Mr. Babcock shook his head and said, "No, I don't think so. I think there's more to it. 2 days before he died, Jimmy told me he wanted out. Something happened that scared him half to death. He told me that if something happened to him, to come to you. He said to tell you." Mr. Babcock stopped a moment and considered his words. I could see the incredulity in his eyes as he continued. "He said to tell you that the Alu were far more dangerous than Lucy was. He said to tell you that they were the power behind the Skraelings." He stopped and asked, "Do you know what that means? What are the Alu? What are the Skraelings?" I shook my head and said, "Alu is a bastardization of an old Hebrew word that means shining ones. There's a bunch of garbage out there about them being from Atlantis, generally mystical hogwash." "What about the Skraelings?" he asked. I stopped and looked at him. "How much do you know about Leif Erikson?" I asked. He shrugged and said, "He was a Viking explorer. I think that I read somewhere that some people claimed he discovered America before Columbus." I nodded and replied, "He did. He established several colonies here." I didn't tell him that my mother was among those colonists. Nobody is sure why they pulled out. Some think the Native Americans forced them out. Others say it was politics back in Iceland and Sweden. Writings from that time refer to attacks on the colonies by Skraelings. "What does it mean?" Mr. Babcock asked. "Literally, it's Old Norse for wretched ones. Most people assume that they were the Native Americans." I told him, wondering about it. Mum refused to talk about the Skraelings. She said that we didn't have to worry about them anymore. I know that she would always shudder slightly when she talked about them, and this was coming from a woman who'd once kicked Charlemagne where it counts, who was a master swordsmith. The Skraelings had frightened her so bad that the echo of it had lasted 1,000 years. "Native Americans?" Mr. Babcock asked. I smiled at him. "I'm sorry. It's the direct translation of what the Swedes call Indians. Inhims, Americans. I never got used to calling them Indians. I lied to him to cover up my anachronistic slip of the tongue. How do you know all this? Why would Jimmy want me to tell you this? Can you help? I frowned and said, Mr. Babcock, I'll do everything I can to find out what really happened. If Jimmy was murdered, I promise you, I'll bring them to justice. If he was killed experimenting with near death, I'll go after the people that encouraged him. Why? Mr. Babcock asked. Why is it that you are more concerned about my son than the police? It's their job. I gave them all the information about this, but they just ignored me. I put a hand on his shoulder and said, because he was my friend. Because that's what friends do. I listened to the other room for a moment. The others were discussing plans to get together for a camping trip in a few weeks. I turned back to Mr. Babcock and said, I'll do what I can. But what does all of this mean? He asked. It means that you are overly tired. I'll look into it. You need to go home and rest. Everything will be okay. I told him as I began to weave a spell of comfort and forgetfulness on him. It wasn't hard. He was in my home, in my domain. And since my land taking, not long after the Lucy affair, magic on the property became much easier for me. He shook his head and said, No, nothing will ever be all right again. My boy is dead, and I have to collect his things from his apartment. I put a hand on his shoulder as he rose, his hat still in his hand, and said, I know, I miss him, too, but they say time heals all wounds. And I released the spell. I tell you what, I'll go clean out his apartment for you. That way, you won't have to. The man looked up at me with tears threatening his eyes. Jimmy had good friends. Thank you, Win. He reached into his pocket and said, Here's the key to his place. Thank you again for everything. I'm honored to do it, Mr. Babcock, I told him. He nodded and I saw him out. I then rejoined everyone and made apologies for Mr. Babcock, until I was sure one way or another I didn't want to worry them. Instead, I told them that Mr. Babcock had asked me to clean out Jimmy's apartment for him. They nodded to me, as if they understood. We talked a little more, making plans for a camping trip into the West Virginia mountains in the next few weeks. I had no idea how long this investigation was going to take, but I figured that a camping trip would be a good idea for all of us. It would take our minds off things. I had acquired a couple of coal mines when I was reshuffling my assets, and I wanted to check them out. The profit margin I was getting out of them was a little too good to be true, and so I wanted to get a first-hand look at the books. I could kill two birds with one stone, as they say. George and Betty were the last to leave. I got the feeling that George wanted to talk to me. I know I wanted to talk to him. After he got Betty settled into the front of his Buick, he then came back up onto the porch to talk to me. I got the feeling he was feeling bad about the lie. Listen, Win, about Jimmy's girl. I raised an eyebrow and said, I got the feeling you were protecting somebody. I would have asked if Mr. Babcock hadn't come tonight. He wants me to check into some things Jimmy mentioned. I just don't want to end up telling him something that would upset him. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, George said. If he didn't tell his dad about her, that meant he thought he'd disapprove. What is she? Colored? Jewish? A he? I asked. George looked surprised at the last one and said, No, that's not Jimmy. He didn't say he didn't want to tell his dad about her. He told me he was afraid for his dad to meet her. He stopped for a minute and said, I got the feeling he was afraid for his dad. He was maybe a little afraid of her. I nodded. That wasn't the Jimmy I knew. He charged into a nest of vampires to save his friends. It would take something serious to frighten Jimmy Babcock. Do you know her name? I asked. Zilla Lamech, he replied. Weird name if you ask me. He said she was named for somebody in the Bible. I smiled. The first thing that came to mind when I heard Zilla was actually 300 feet of fire-breathing lizard stomping through downtown Tokyo. Still, named for somebody in the Bible, and Jimmy's message had mentioned the Ilu. I needed more information. Look, when I go to clean out Jimmy's place, do you want to come with me? He gave me a strange look. What's up, Win? I shrugged and said, I don't know yet. I'll let you know tomorrow, if you want to come with me. Pick me up around 10? He asked. I will do, I told him as he backed down the steps. I suddenly got the same feeling that we had back 4 years ago when we were chasing down Lucy. The mystery of it all started to stir the soul of this little cat. It was time to go back to work. I had an idea. There was a specific spell that all the mage cats know. It was one of the spells the old father mentioned, Havamal. It wasn't a whole lot of use to us in modern times. Hanging was no longer the preferred method of execution in my own time, and it was going out of style in this one. But it still offered me some hope to get some answers. The fact that Jimmy hanged himself gave me a source of information if I had the stomach and raw callousness to take it. I went upstairs to change. I had plans, and they were going to involve a little late-night magic in a cemetery. I gathered the things I was going to need for a rather grisly spell and put them in an old rucksack. I wasn't going to use a shovel tonight. That would take forever and offered too much of a chance of being discovered. Instead, my sister-in-law had taught me just a few useful spells. When I was finished, though, I just hoped nobody tried to exhume Jimmy's body. Slipping into the cemetery was easy. I didn't even have to use a fog spell to cover the grounds, and what I was doing, it was already there. Oddly enough, the cemetery on a moonless night was not the least bit intimidating to me. As my dad used to say, it's not the people in their graves that you have to worry about. And by the time I was set up, my watch told me it was well past 1 o'clock. No, I didn't need the witching hour for what I was about to do. I'm not that kind of mage. It took me less than 5 minutes to get the earth moved and the polished maple coffin on the ground beside the pile. I was gentle. Jimmy was a friend, after all. Before I opened the casket, I got the things I would need for the spell. My sea axe, my reddening agent, and a candle. The grisly part of the work was that the spell had to be carved into Jimmy. That was something to which I was not looking forward to. When I was ready, I gently pried the lid open and found my friend lying there, as if he was asleep. Looking around and listening for anyone approaching, I went to work. I carved the rune and reddened it with my own blood and some beeswax. When I was finished, I sang the spell. Patkan ek itopta, efe ek siatre opi, vafa velgina, sva ek rista, ok ironem thaka. Atsa genrim gumi okimaliar virmik. I released my will and let the spell fly. I felt it reach out for Jimmy, but found nothing. At first I was confused. The spell went off the way it was supposed to. I could feel it working, but Jimmy wasn't answering its call. And then it dawned on me. I looked down at him, smiled and said softly, You didn't die by hanging, did you, old friend? You were murdered and then hanged to cover it up. Of course he didn't answer me. If he had, then it would have proven me wrong. This was all the proof that I needed. It wasn't anything I could take to the cops, but it was the confirmation of a theory. Now it was up to me to decide what to do with it. I closed Jimmy's shirt and then the lid of the coffin and placed it back into the bottom of the grave. Looking around, I shook my head. It was better to leave a mystery than leave open a chance of hurting Jimmy's father and any further. I pulled my will into me and sang a very useful and very powerful rune stave. When I released it, A brilliant flash of fire and light engulfed the coffin in the bottom of the grave. In a matter of seconds, it had burned itself down to nothing but charred ashes. Even the bones were consumed by the power of that particular spell. I quickly filled in the grave, set things right about the area, collected my things, and headed on home. I had a lot to think about. The next day, I collected George and we headed over to Jimmy's place. George must have sensed the turmoil in my mind. As we toured down K Street towards the apartment building where Jimmy had lived, he looked over at me and said, "Okay, Win, spill it." I smiled and said matter-of-factly, "Jimmy didn't hang himself. He was murdered." He nodded and asked, "And you know this? How?" I shook my head and told him, "Trust me, you don't want to know." "More of that Nordic magic stuff?" he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "More Nordic magic," I told him. "Then it's not something we can take to the buttons?" he sighed. "Why do I get the feeling you suspected the same thing?" I asked. "Look, I know Jimmy was always a little wacky. He just spent too much time in the blues to be on the level, but I never thought he'd go as far as kissing himself off." I nodded and said, "I tend to agree. I don't know how he died, but he didn't die from hanging himself." He looked over at me for a moment and then said, "You didn't?" I nodded and said, "I did what I had to do, what I will always do to protect my friends. When I can't protect them, then I'm going to hurt the person who hurts them a lot." "When?" he protested. "It was Jimmy, for crying out loud." By the whine in his voice, I knew he was hurt by whatever it was that he suspected I'd done. I looked over at him and asked, "I know who it was, and don't think I won't live with what I've done for the rest of my life, but I won't let whoever did this get away." He nodded at me and swallowed. We were silent for the rest of the trip. I had one more spell I wanted to use. It was a bit of psychometry I had picked up from Mum. Before we packed up anything, I was going to see what had happened in that apartment the night Jimmy died. I would have my answers. Unfortunately, they would only generate more questions. As we got out of the car, I pulled my bag and broom out. George gave me a strange look. "What have you got in mind, Win?" "Just a little something my mum taught me." I grunted to him as I grabbed the bag, trying to put the images of the night before out of my head. This conversation was beginning to get to me. It was easier to deal with as long as I didn't have to think about some of it too much. Sometimes I wonder how Trey deals with what he did on the nights of Howes. The blood eagle is not something for the squeamish. We weren't silent as we traipsed up the stairs, our leather shoes echoing off the surrounding wood. Reaching his door, I pulled out the key and went on inside. I could see where the room hadn't been cleaned since they cut poor Jimmy down from the light fixture. I started to let my eyes shift into my other sight, but the sounds of someone else on the stairs stopped me. In a few moments, a small balding man who looked like a store clerk out of one of the old westerns came in. "Can I help you, fellas?" he asked. I smiled and said, "I'm Win Greenbow, and this is George Tomlinson. Mr. Babcock sent us over to gather Jimmy's things." "Did he send you this month's rent too?" he asked. I raised an eyebrow at him. I was pretty damn calloused, but it was the depression and money was tight. "How much is it?" I asked. $25, he said. I looked around the apartment and realized he was asking an outrageous amount for a little 4-room place. I raised an eyebrow at his declaration and he quickly added, "That includes electricity, water, and gas." Shaking my head, I reached for my wallet and handed him $100. "This will cover the next 4 months. I give it a key back then." Now he looked at me and then at the money. Even George's eyes bugged out a bit. At it, $100 was more than a month's wages for a lot of working men, but I wanted to have access to this place for a while, and I didn't want to be bothered by snooping eyes. That's a lot of money, fella. You're some friend." "I want a receipt," I told him. He stopped and looked at me. "I'm as honest as the day is long." I looked at the C-note in his hand and he went away mumbling. All right, I'll get your receipt." He went walking away. "When?" George said. "Why on earth did you do that?" "Because I may need to come back here later to check some things out. I'd rather not have to be disturbed." "Well, we better get to work," he said, looking around. I shook my head. "Not just yet. I don't want to move things until after I've done what I need to do, and I don't want to start that until after the landlord has left us in peace." I told him, and so we waited until the little man came back with a receipt and then left again. Then I closed and locked the door. I told George, "I want you to stand right there and watch." "Watch what?" he asked. "The spell is called Munin's Eye," I told him. "It will show us what happened here." He looked at me with a surprise as I broke out the materials I needed for it. Some of them I collected last night, but most of it was pretty mundane. Magic doesn't really require a lot of exotic materials. It just needs mundane things treated a specific way. Mainly for this, I needed something to connect it to Jimmy. I had more than what I needed here. I began to carve the rune stave I needed into the small wax candle I had, and when I was ready, I set it down in the middle of the floor, lit it, and stepped back. Singing the runes, I released my will. A mist began to bellow up from the floor as the events in the room began to play backwards, and for long moments we watched an empty room. But after a few minutes, we could see the events of Jimmy's body being carried out and all the way back to Mr. Babcock's discovery of him. The figures were muted, indistinct, like one picture superimposed on another, but we would clearly see faces and figures formed from the mist. Next to me, I heard George gasp in disbelief as the spell worked, as the whole scene was played out in reverse. For long moments, we watched Jimmy's body hang from the ceiling, where the light fixture was attached. Then there were several smoky, indistinct forms in the room. They were little more than blurs in the mist, and we could make out no details. "What are those?" George asked in a low whisper, and I shook my head and said, "I don't know. They should be as clear as the rest of the images. Something is hiding their true form." We watched as time ran back, as the misty forms moved about the room. To us, it looked like they slowly took Jimmy's body down from the ceiling, but I knew that we were simply seeing the room's memory in reverse. We watched as the two exited, leaving Jimmy's body lying on the floor with a single misty outline in the room. And for long moments, nothing else happened until it went to the phone. As it put the phone down, we watched as it went back over to Jimmy and knelt beside him. And for a few seconds, it stayed there. Then we saw it slowly raise him to his feet, and there was a sudden twist of his head. And although the images were silent, I could almost hear the audible crack of his neck breaking. They kissed for a few seconds and then pulled away. Jimmy and the misty outline were arguing, and it looked heated. I wished the spell granted the ability to hear, but it didn't, and I didn't know the one that would allow that. Believe it or not, it's much more difficult. Jimmy kept shrugging like he didn't know something. A mystery person, whom I was now convinced was a woman, kept demanding. "Well, I've seen enough, Win," George said, and I looked over at him. The shock on his face told me all I needed to know. I nodded and released the spell. The candle melted into nothing, the power spent. I knew that I wouldn't be able to use it again. The memories of this place had been burned out in the casting. "Do you think the other form was its goal?" I shrugged and said, "I don't know. Jimmy didn't strike me as the kind of guy who would have a little something on the side." "He wasn't," George said. "But Jimmy was a big guy. How could a woman break his neck like that?" I shook my head and said, "George, not all women are weak. Lucy could toss around most men like ragdolls." And I thought for a moment as I began to pace out on the floor. but I don't think she was a woman. "I told you, Jimmy doesn't mess with guys," George said, and there was an unspoken admission that he knew someone who did. "I'm not talking about that, George," I said. "I'm not sure she was a human woman. She may have looked like one at least to Jimmy or anyone else who saw her, but I think she was something called an aloo." "What's an aloo?" he asked. "That's the problem, George. I don't know. But I know someone who does, or who can find out for me." "Who?" he asked. "The Recondite Order," I said. "They won't talk to you," he said. "Well, Joe will, but the rest of them want you hired in front of their fireplaces." And I chuckled and said, "I know, but since we aren't shooting at each other, maybe they'll be a little more open." "You can hope," George said. "Yeah, I can hope," I replied as we set out to pack up Jimmy's things. I mainly wanted to get anything that might embarrass Jimmy's dad. Trey once told me that part of the duty of the best friend should be to clean up your friend's hard drive and search history before anyone else saw it. To me, this was the 1930s version of that. And to be honest, outside of some mildly pornographic art books, there wasn't really anything there. It took us most of the day to get it emptied and in boxes. We took the food in the pantry down to the local soup kitchen. Somebody at least needed to get some use out of it. We got the rest of the personal stuff packed up and in the back of my other cell. Before we left, I took a box of sea salt I'd brought and the broom. There was a bit of cleansing ritual dedicated to the All Mother that I performed. I have a friend who swears by it. He said he once used it to clean out the bad spirits in his home brought there by a very bad witch. According to him, she wasn't evil. She was just bad at being a witch. Anyway, the spell not only got rid of the bad spirits, but the bad roommates as well. It was perfect for putting to rest anything that might still be in the apartment. As we settled into the front seat of my car, I looked over at George and said, "I'm going to stop by the bookstore." "Which bookstore, Win?" he asked. "Dunstan's," I told him. "Where Joe is." "Well, I'm going with you then," he said. "That might not be a good idea. Like you said, they don't like me very much," I told him. He shook his head and said, "What a more reason for me to watch your back." I shrugged and replied, "Suit yourself." It was only about a 15-minute drive from Jimmy's place to the bookstore. I could tell that George was a little weirded out by what had happened in the apartment. And finally, he sighed and said, "You'd make a great detective. You know that, Win?" I shook my head. "Nothing we know now can be introduced as evidence into court," I told him. "The judge would laugh me out of the courtroom." "You could show him," George said. "Yeah, and then disappear somewhere. What I can do scares a lot of people, George. You included. It's best to keep it a secret." "I'm sorry for busting your chops about last night, Win. I can tell that you don't enjoy what you're doing," he finally said. "It's okay, George. Believe it or not, it does bother me. I don't know which bothers me more, though. The fact that I couldn't speak to him, or if I'd been able to." "Why?" he asked. "Because I would have been ripping his soul from wherever it is and interrogating it. He wouldn't have had much of a choice but to come and answer me truthfully. Granted, I don't think that he'd have tried to hide anything, but still, it would have been a compulsion," I said. "I don't like compelling my friends to do anything." He nodded and smiled. I got the feeling he was starting to understand that this wasn't a game with me. It wasn't something which to play parlor tricks. For me, this is what I am, what I do, and sometimes it wasn't very nice. 5 minutes later, as we entered the store, and as we crossed the threshold, I could feel wards at the door push against me. I looked over at Martin, who was sitting behind the counter reading. He looked up at me and said, "What are you doing here?" Disgust and just a bit of fear were dripping from his voice. "I came to see Joe," I told him. "I need some information." We don't help the dark breed, he said, getting up, and I could see his hand start creeping towards his jacket. Don't be stupid, Martin. Joe's voice interrupted us from down one of the aisles. If you pull that gun, he's liable to make you eat it. Then turning to me, he said, Hello, Win, George. Hi, Joe, I told him. How can I help you? He asked. I need some information about a name that doesn't mean a lot to me, I said. What name? Ilu, I told him. I watched the colour drain out of his face. What do you know about the Ilu? He asked. Nothing, I told him. That's the problem. I think they're involved with killing one of my friends. Joe's face was a mask, unreadable. I've seen what you do to people who threaten and hurt your friends. I shudder to think what you're going to do to someone who actually does. Who was killed? Jimmy, George said. They broke his neck and then hung him from the light fixture to make it look like a suicide. And how do you know what they did? Martin demanded. I turned to look at him and said, Don't ask questions. You don't want to know the answer to, Martin. It just makes us both uneasy. I can handle anything that makes you uneasy, Martin said. I smiled at him and replied, Okay. I used Martin's eye. He raised an eyebrow at me and said, That particular spell has never been corroborated as being accurate. It has never worked twice on the same location. I chuckled at him and said, Sometimes being ignorant is less dangerous than a little information. Of course it doesn't work twice in the same place. Magic requires energy to work. It burns out the memory of the place to fuel itself. You could, of course, supply it with another form of energy, but the only one I know of that works is to spill innocent blood, and unlike your friend Leon, I won't do that. Game, point and match, Martin, Joe said. I'm sorry to hear about your friend Jimmy. He was a good kid. What makes you think it was the Ilu? Because his father came to me last night. He said that about 2 days before Jimmy died, Jimmy had told him that if anything should happen to him, that Mr. Babcock was to come to me. He said to tell me that the Ilu were the power behind the Skraelings. I watched as Joe listened to what I said. I felt something press against my mind, a command to leave the premises. I just about had enough out of Martin. I turned and looked at him. He was wearing his usual brown tweed suit. I smiled and concentrated on the buttons of his fly. And luckily they, unlike the tweed of his slacks, were non-organic, brass to be specific. I used my gift from Freya to turn the outer layer of them into urushiol. He was going to be in for an unpleasant few days. Why would he call them Ilu? Joe asked. I shrugged and said, I don't know. I know the name is bastardization of the Hebrew word meaning shining ones. You speak Hebrew? Martin asked in surprise. My parents taught me a lot of languages, Martin. I'm very educated, I told him in exasperation. I turned back to where Joe was finally limping down the aisle on his cane to join us. He stopped for a moment at the shelves and pulled down a book. He pushed past me in the tight confines of the bookstore, opened a huge leather-bound tome, and lay it on the counter. Well, how's your ancient Hebrew? Not as rusty as you might think. One of my majors was archaeology, I told him. Then it should serve you well here, he said as he began reading. From what I can tell, the Ilu were the sons and daughters of the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men mentioned in Genesis 6. Some people say that they are the giants mentioned there as well, but I'm not so sure. I think that since the giants are mentioned separately from the Ilu, they are the same. I nodded and said, My own experiences with giants is that they are elemental forces who take physical form. Yes, if they take a human as a mate, then the children are likely to be powerful, but I don't see them as forming their own race. I tend to agree, Joe said. How do you know so much about giants? Martin asked. I'm a Northman, Martin. We know about giants. I told him. And turning back to Joe, I asked, "The sons of God, not the sons of gods?" I asked. "Yeah, it's singular," he said. "Of course it's singular," Martin interjected. "Martin, shut up," George finally interjected. The big man looked at my friend in shock. "I don't have to take any lip off you, young'un." And finally, I had enough. I looked up from where I was reading and asked, "Martin, do you know what you say to an angry witch?" I watched as he thought about my question, and finally he shook his head and said, "No." "Ribbit," I told him. It took a few moments for what I said to sink in. "Okay, I'm shutting up." "Good," George, Joe and I said simultaneously. "How do you know the Ilu are the children of those unions?" I asked. He shrugged and said, "I don't. It's just fairly accepted law. Some of it has been even made into the modern occultist movement. Some of the mystics are saying stuff about them being ancient Atlanteans." I shook my head and said, "I don't think so. From what I know about the ancient Atlanteans, which, granted, isn't much, they didn't have anything to do with Yahweh. According to the Chronicles of Balance, the head goddess was not happy with Yahweh because of what he did to Vincian the Grey." "I never heard that story," Joe said. I shook my head and told him, "That's a bit of extra teaching we got as mage cats." "Who was Vincian?" George asked. "When Lilith refused to submit to Adam, Yahweh sent 3 angels, Sanvi, Sansavi, and Semegalev, to force her back to her husband. When she refused, they cursed her to become the first vampire and started killing her children. She fled to Atlantis with her surviving offspring, and there was given shelter by a nobleman named Vincian. When he refused to turn her over to the angels, they cursed him as well. He is a very old and very wise vampire," I told him. "One of the first of the Forsaken." "That's hogwash," Martin said. I looked over at Joe and asked, "Do you have a bucket of water to keep him in?" "I could see if we got something in the back," Joe said. "You could always use the toilet," George suggested. Martin sank back into his chair and held up his hands. "Tell him about the spell, Win," George suggested. "What about it?" Joe asked. "Whoever was responsible for killing Jimmy didn't show up clearly on the spell. They were just an indistinct blur, like smoke or something." Joe rubbed his jaw. "That sort of fits what we know about the Ilu. We haven't encountered many, but we know they have powerful minds that are capable of resisting even the strongest mesmerism." Martin started to say something, but George leaned over the counter and said, "Is it pertinent to the conversation?" Martin said, "No." "Then keep it to yourself," George told him. "We also think that they're shapeshifters. They got the power to cloud men's minds," Joe said. "Like the shadow?" George asked. "Something like that," Joe said. "We know that a mirror shows their true face, and they will go a mile out of their way to avoid their own shadow." "Anything else about them that I should know?" I asked. "Some people say that the horn skulls found in Pennsylvania about 50 years ago were Ilu skulls," he said. "That and the fact that they're nearly 7 feet tall." I nodded and replied, "Okay, well, that should make them stand out." "You would think so," he said. "That's about all I know." "That's more information than I had before," I told him. "Thanks for the help. We'll have to get together for dinner sometime." And looking over at George, I said, "Come on, we need to catch the ferry before it's too late." "Good luck," Joe said. "Keep me informed." "Will do," I told him. "Bye, Martin," I added as George and I left the store. "Is that guy like that every time you go there?" George asked. "Who? Martin?" I asked, and George nodded. "Yeah, pretty much. First time I met him, he tried to lock me in with a ward." "Sounds like a barrel of laughs," George said. Oh, it is. And Joe and I have actually managed to become friends in spite of it, I said. When? Would you really have turned him into a frog? George asked. I shook my head and said, no, that kind of spell was just too much work. With just a piece of advice, I wouldn't shake hands with him for a while if I were you. What did you do? He asked me. Oh, nothing. He's just going to have a very bad case of poison ivy in a very uncomfortable place by tomorrow. I don't like people who try to invade my mind. And the rest of the trip home was mostly in silence. We made it to Mr. Babcock's just before sundown. After we unloaded Jimmy's things, and I dropped George off at his place, it was nearly 8 o'clock by the time I got home. A package was waiting for me by the door. I picked it up and found it to be unusually heavy. Looking at the postage, I realized that it cost quite a bit to ship by mail. Then I saw who had mailed it. James Babcock. I wasn't about to carry this across my own wards. Instead, I took the package out back to the small workshop I had set up out there near the V. Turning on the light, I closed the door behind me and set the package down on a heavy workbench I use for working metal. And I carefully pulled the wrapping off to find a wooden crate inside. With a crowbar, I pried open the top and was surprised to find another box inside the crate. This one was a simple hook clasp holding shut the lid. I warily undid that and tipped the lid back with the end of the crowbar. A dim red light began to glow around the seam and grew brighter as I opened the lid. Inside was a human skull with a 7-inch horn sticking out above each eye. And from inside the eyes, a red light was pulsing with an evil hum that pounded against my ears and my mind. The Feline Factor 2. The Horned Skull. Chapter 2. Let's get straight into that. I could feel the malevolent urgings of whatever force occupied that skull pressing at my thoughts, trying to find a way to twist them to do its bidding. Images of murder and mayhem danced across my vision. Urges I've kept under tight control came roaring to the surface of my mind and body. They were trying to release the deepest, most primal forces of my personality and who I am. But I am a mage cat. I've held those urges in place and under control since the day I was born. I was raised with a mother who was a telepath. I know how to not only control my body and mind, but to protect them as well. I clamped down hard with my own shields, such as they were, and used the iron crowbar to close the lid on the box. I heard screams of anguish in my head just before the lid abruptly cut them off. I wondered what it was about the box that seemed to cut off the voices and the compulsion of the skull. Well, it was something I would have to explore at another time. But first, I had to think. I had to sort through the conundrum that this box offered. Why would Jimmy send me this skull? What value did it have? And was it the reason that the Elu killed him? This clue brought far more questions than answers. Looking over at the box, I latched it shut and then sealed it up again, this time in an iron block. I rested several protective runes into each side of it and then reddened and sealed them. And finally, I slid it under the anvil. Anybody looking would just see another piece of rusty metal with some designs on it waiting to be worked. The box was obviously what the woman in the spell was asking Jimmy about. It was what they were willing to kill my friend to get back. They were not going to stop looking for it. Thinking about that, I decided it was time to start looking for this Zilla Lemek. I wasn't sure where to start, except maybe with Jimmy's boss. Locking the door to the shed, I headed back into the house, wondering where else I could start. As I turned over the events of the day, I contemplated my options. I didn't really have any leads on where to find this mysterious Miss Lamek, but maybe Jimmy had other friends at work who may have met her. I had a light dinner and did some reading before turning in. Tomorrow, I had plans to start asking questions at Jimmy's architectural firm. I would need my wits about me and my mind fresh. Since the previous night's gruesome task had deprived me of a good night's sleep, I decided that an early evening was in order. The day must have affected me more than usual, as I had nightmares of my friends being hung one by one, and I was unable to stop it. Some invisible force was holding me back, making me watch as a mysterious woman dropped a noose around each of their necks. I could see them pleading for me to stop it, but as much as I struggled, I couldn't stop the scene of horror as it played out in my dreams. I awoke suddenly when the bed collapsed and I realized that I had shifted into my battle form in the middle of one of the dreams. I forced my mind to calm down and shifted back into natural form, my mage cat form. For some reason, the dreams left me unnerved, and I felt the need for my ears and tail as I pulled on a pair of shorts and t-shirt and padded downstairs for a glass of milk and maybe a piece of chocolate cake that Mrs. McCain had baked. The woman really was getting too old to be keeping my house, but I didn't want to let her go because her husband had recently been laid off from his job at the docks. Right now, hers was the only income coming into their home. The Great Depression was even hitting our sleepy little town hard. I had made some arrangements with the grocer and butcher about any shortfall in their bill, but had to be careful not to bruise the woman's pride. Still, she was my friend, and a Northman takes care of his friends and family when they fall on hard times. As I entered the kitchen, I felt something push against the walls of the property. It wasn't a usual kid sneaking out to go fishing down on the point that I'd learned to recognize, or even the occasional hobo rummaging for something to eat. It was stronger, it was mystical, and it was the kind of thing that placed a significant drain on the wards, and it was malevolent. In the distance I heard the roll of a late spring thunderstorm, and the winds began to pick up as the probe slid off the wards. The storm didn't feel natural. I could feel the energy of the spell building, and realized that was what had sent the bad dreams. I frowned at the thought as I felt the spell expanding, searching for something. The backlash from it hitting my wards with what was creating a thunderstorm as they drained energy from the search and dumped it into the atmosphere as heat. The fact that it was this powerful suggested that the strength of the search was a formidable one indeed. Still, I trusted my wards to hold. I fixed myself a glass of milk and cut a piece of the cake and sat down to listen to the thunder roll in. In some ways it was relaxing, especially when I realized that the cause of my nightmares was dancing out there on the winds. I doubted that they'd come to realize that their search was being blocked. Part of the protection wards was to shunt a mystical hunt around the property and not appear as an actual shield. Unless they were very good at predicting the weather, not even a thunderstorm would give it away. I finished my cake and went back upstairs, stood the broken pieces of bed in a corner, and laid the springs and the mattress directly on the floor, where I slept the rest of the night. There were no more probes, no more nightmares, only a slightly sour stomach in the morning from the milk. Mrs. McCain was downstairs when I came down, shaved and ready to pound the pavement. Even after 4 years, I was missing my long hair and the opportunity to grow a beard. Yeah, I could do it, but it wouldn't fit the image I needed during the Great Depression. I would probably be another 30 years before I could get away with a beard and long hair. I wondered how Trey dealt with it in the Navy, but then realized that he always knew where he was going and what he would do. I envied him for that. Don't you look dapper this morning?" she said in that rich Irish brooch of hers. "Thank you. I'm going to DC today, so I won't need any lunch or dinner. Since I'll probably be all day and I'll eat there," I said with a smile and settled into the table where there was a fresh sausage, eggs, gravy and biscuits waiting on me. "Oh, and don't bother with my room today, Mrs. McCain. I gotta replace my bed." She cocked an eye at me and asked with a wicked smile, "You've been entertaining?" and she had figured out over the few times that I had a guest stay over. Not that there had been that many over the past 4 years. I was wary of bringing anyone inside my wards, and most of my trysts were either in a hotel in Midvale or at the other participants' home. What was the saying? A woman prefers her own bed. Well, the same could be said for some men as well. With a grin and a blush, I told her, "No, ma'am, I think it's just old wood. I've been hearing a lot of extra creaks in it over the last few months as it is. Last night, I was sort of tossing and turning, and it collapsed on me. I'll stop by Mr. Fenton's furniture store and have a new one delivered tomorrow." "And what will you do for tonight?" she asked. "The mattress and springs are still good. I'll just sleep on the floor with them," I told her. She shook her head and said, "You are the most practical young man I've ever met," and then swatted me with a dish towel and said, "Now eat up, for it gets cold." "Yes, ma'am," I told her and dug into the fine breakfast she had prepared. A quick stop in town to take care of the bed issue, and I was off to Washington. It didn't take long to find the firm where Jimmy had worked. It was one of the more upscale establishments in DC, and I briefly wondered why they had offices here and not in New York, as they had, after all, designed the Empire State Building. As I approached the main offices of Mr. Ew, I was still mulling over exactly how to approach the obviously very professional men with investigating something as sordid as a suicide and hunting down a woman. However, it seemed that Jimmy had already paved the way without even knowing it. As I approached his secretary outside the huge office, I smiled at the young woman and said, "Hello, my name is Win Greenbow. I don't have an appointment, but I was wondering if I could speak with someone about my friend, James Babcock." The woman looked up at me in surprise and said, "Oh, of course, Mr. Greenbow. Mr. Ew said you might be stopping by and to show you in." "Really?" I asked. "Yes. Mr. Babcock spoke highly of you and suggested that you may wish to hire the firm's services," she said, disappearing into the big doors behind her. Thanks to my enhanced senses, I heard her voice quite clearly. "The young man that Mr. Babcock said may wish to hire our services to design a rather eclectic home is in the outer office, Mr. Ew." Now that was something I hadn't considered. I was perfectly comfortable in my little Queen Anne. I wondered what made Jimmy think that I might be wanting to build a new home. "Please, send him in," I heard a man's voice say. It didn't take long for the woman to return and do as she was bade. Entering the well-appointed offices, I saw a tall man with greying hair and a very elegant and angular features getting up from his desk. He was dressed in a smart business suit, and there was the unpleasant smell of stale tobacco about him. That was the one thing to which I was having the most trouble adapting to in the past. Everybody and their brother smoked. "Welcome to Port Ew and Marks, Mr. Greenbow. The late Mr. Babcock told us a great deal about you." He gestured towards a large, overstuffed chair and said, "Won't you sit down?" "Thank you," I told him. I decided to let him make his sales pitch and maybe get more information on how to proceed. My dad always told me that you can learn more from someone by letting them talk than by asking them questions. And since both he and Mum had been investigators and agents for the DNA and our home reality, I considered his advice to be good. "James said that you would eventually want something larger, something with unusually high ceilings and large doors. He thought you'd be interested in a large home, what would co-equally be a mansion. He mentioned that you were living well below your station in life," Mr. Ew said. I thought about that. I hadn't really considered whether or not I had outgrown the house. In many senses, I had. I was still just one man who rarely entertained anyone other than close friends. I had no family to speak of. On the other hand, though, there was a certain danger to being what I am in a house such as mine. Last night's adventure with the bed was a case in point. Brunhild had, on more than one occasion, told me to live my life like a Northman, like the grandson of Jarl. Up until recently, my current residence has suited my needs, and to be honest, I hadn't considered a new home. But now that I think about it, the construction of a home like you described would solve several problems for me at once. What other suggestions did Jimmy make? I asked. And sensing that he had a client, Mr. Eve smiled and leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, James said that you value your privacy, Mr. Greenbow, and that you were a good friend. He said that you had unusual tastes and made several early sketches and designs too, which I could approach you with at a later date. Some of them are quite unusual, but he felt they would be important to you." I nodded, listening to what he had to say. Evidently, he thought long and hard about the kinds of things I would need to keep my secret, yet live well. I actually appreciated that. I nodded and said, "I'd love to see what he came up with." "That of course can be arranged," Mr. Yu said. "But you said that you hadn't considered a new home. That suggests that you had another reason for visiting us." I nodded and considered my line of questioning carefully. I wanted to get as much information as possible without giving away anything. And finally, I said, "James sent me a package that I believe was ultimately intended as some kind of gift for a lady that he was seeing. It appears to be quite valuable, and I would like to make sure that she gets it, but I only have her name. I'm trying to be as discreet as possible. I was wondering if someone from your office could help me find her. Her name is Zilla Lamech." Well, I could see the look of surprise in his face. I was unaware that Mr. Babcock and Miss Lamech were becoming involved, Mr. Greenbow. It is highly unusual for our architects to become socially attached with our clients. I nodded and began to weave a spell to loosen his inhibitions. I released it and said, "I understand, but I don't wish to cause the lady any embarrassment. But being as the gift is quite valuable, and in these financial times, even someone of great wealth would hate to lose such an asset. You say she's a client of yours?" I could see the spell begin to take effect. It wasn't as powerful as I would like, as I could neither wrist nor redden it, but it was affecting him. He nodded and said, "Our firm is designing a building for her here in Washington. Mr. Babcock was responsible for designing the interior support structures and was working rather closely with her. She had some unusual requirements for it." "I see," I said. "Could you possibly put me in contact with her?" I asked. "That's an unusual request, Mr. Greenbow," he waffled. "But under the circumstances, I think I can arrange it. I do feel the need to let the lady know you'll be calling, however." "Of course," I said. "Like I said, I wouldn't want to cause her any embarrassment. Normally, I would handle something like this through Jimmy's father, who is my banker and my financial advisor. But under the circumstances, I'd rather not trouble him any more than he already is with the loss of his son." "You are a considerate man, Mr. Greenbow," the man said. "I try to treat people with respect, Mr. Yu," I told him with a smile. "I can see that," he replied. "I think I can trust you to be discreet with whatever you may learn." "Of course," I said. "I'm even more protective of my friends' reputation than I am of strangers, Mr. Yu." Raising an eyebrow, I said, "I'm even more protective of their persons." He nodded to me and said, "I'll see that Miss Johnson gets you the contact information, Mr. Greenbow." I could tell he wanted to press me about the house, and I smiled and said, "I'd also like to set up an appointment with one of your architects to discuss the other project. I find that it intrigues me, and honestly, it did. My grandfather had a rather large steeding in Alfheim, and Trey was set to inherit our house in Alabama. Something of my own. It would be nice. Making my mark on this world out from under the rather famous brother's shadow had an appeal I hadn't realized existed." "I'm glad to hear it, Mr. Greenbow. Miss Johnson will arrange that for you, and 10 minutes later, I was on my way over to Massachusetts Avenue to a rather large mansion. I raised an eyebrow at the sight of the place. This was a level of ostentation that was considered to be in a bad taste during these times. Personally, I didn't have a problem with people who generated wealth. Well, it takes capital to drive industry, and without industry, there are no jobs. But at the same time, picking a fight with a great many people is not always the wise thing to do. This was a huge mansion on a large estate. It was at least 50 rooms, and I could see that only a portion of it was being occupied. It was, however, well cared for. Again, I found myself playing this by ear as I approached the large front door. Ringing a bell, I waited. It wasn't long before a butler answered the door. He was a short, heavy-set man with thick jowls and dark eyes. Every brown hair was in place and his white gloves were spotless. There was something about him that felt strange. It wasn't evil, but it was in pain. If I'd been a telepath like my mother, then I'd been able to tell more. As it was, I was limited to using my own senses and powers. "Yes?" he asked. "My name is Wayne Greenbow. I believe Mr. Yu's office called to announce that I was coming on over." "Yes," the man said. "Miss Lamech is currently not in." I nodded and reached into my pocket for one of the cards I'd printed up a few years ago. "I was a friend of Mr. Babcock. I have something for Miss Lamech from him," I told him, producing the card. He looked at the card and then looked at me. I could see both fear and curiosity in his eyes. He looked back at me and said, "Miss Lamech is currently out of the city, Mr. Greenbow. I'm not sure when she will be back." I could see conflict in his eyes. For a moment, I watched as a thin line of his mouth tightened and then relaxed as he was trying to find a way to say something. I switched my vision over to my other sight and I could see his body outlined with a force of a spell, the kind I recognized. It was what I expected, a variation of compulsion. This poor man knew something was wrong. He may know exactly what was wrong, but I was unable to act on it. In a way, it was like a living hell. What I didn't know was that was going to be the theme of this mission. "Thank you," I told him again as I left. This encounter told me far more than what would meet the eye. Lamech may not be Jimmy's murderer, which I believe she was, but she was definitely a nocturnal. That put this mission directly in my area of responsibility. It was time to go home and wait for the next move. In the meantime, I could be sharpening my blades. It was actually over a week before anything came to pass with the situation. I did manage to meet with Mr. Yu's company again to discuss a new home. We agreed on some general design plans. I liked Jimmy's idea of high ceilings and oversized doors. I also ran with the idea past Jimmy's dad. I passed the age where my trust fund was released, so I had full access to my money. But I still ran major purchases past him. He agreed that perhaps if I were to carry out some of the other business investments we discussed, then perhaps a more impressive domicile was in order. And there was still the situation with the Cold Creek mine in West Virginia that was reporting a little too high of a profit margin. I still had other projects going and the group was slowly drifting back together, so there were also social obligations. We continued to plan our camping trip into West Virginia, and both Betty and Dot started hinting at girlfriends they might be willing to ask, to keep things balanced. We both asked them not to. Long John was uncomfortable with the way that might look with his congregation, and I just didn't have time for it. Yeah, I know. I'm supposed to be this slutty were-tiger, but to be honest, I was more focused on other things right now. To worry about getting my lance waxed. For one thing, I wanted to find out more about these Illu, and so I spent a great deal of time in a library at Midvale and at Georgetown University. Oddly enough, the stuff at Midvale was far more useful than Georgetown. There were some pretty damn good scholars there, and they didn't get half the credit that their colleagues in the other universities got. Professor Brainard in the Applied Sciences and Chemistry departments was an absolute genius, if not a bit absent-minded. Professor Harper in the Archaeology and Geology department, of course, was brilliant, even if he did sound like a fictional blue-clad Sentai hero from my own childhood. His philosophy seemed to be the more syllables in a word, the more it was worth. What I found out about the Ilu was there only because of Dr. Harper and his association with several other in-the-know archaeologists and anthropologists throughout the world. There was actually a rather good occultism section at the library. What surprised me the most was that some of the books had come through donations from a university in New England that I thought was entirely fictional. I could see a lot of influence from the recondite order determining what got published and what didn't. I did find out that the Ilu had popped up several times in history and had to be put down. It would seem that their modus operandi was to gain influence over several prominent people and direct things from behind the scene. Oddly enough, most of it was in Europe, and with very little activity here in the US. I wondered how much of what my mother refused to discuss had to do with that. I was coming out to the library late one evening, a little more than a week after my meeting with Mr. Yu, when I ran into George. He smiled at me and said, "You know, Win, you graduated. You can leave the library now. Hell, you can leave the whole school and nobody will say anything." I returned the smile and replied, "I had some research to do. It turns out that the Midvale Polytech Library was some of the best sources." "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you," he said. And from the look on his face, I got the feeling that it was bad news. "What's wrong?" I asked, as we walked down the long granite steps in the fading Virginia summer light. "Most of the gang has backed out of the camping trip," he said. "Really?" I asked. "What's up?" He shrugged and said, "Dot got a call from her advisor. She has to do a summer class in order to get one of the classes she wants this fall. And Long John said that something came up with his congregation." He shrugged and added, "And Betty said that she didn't want to be the only woman on the trip." "I can understand that," I said. "So, it's just you, me, and Eddie?" "Pretty much. Eddie doesn't want to back out because he's been looking for a chance to do some camping for a while. As for me, I get the feeling that the more you start pouring through those books, the more you're going to need someone to watch your back." As we meandered our way across campus towards the parking lot, I nodded and said, "Thanks, George." It was an unusually cool evening for a Virginia summer, and I was actually glad for the long-sleeve shirt that I was wearing. It hadn't taken me long to adjust to the Model A and then the Great Depression clothing styles, but there were times when I missed the clothing of my own era. There is something to be said for t-shirts and zippers, the latter of which was just now being introduced by clothing manufacturers. Suddenly, I felt something surge against my wards. Something was pushing past them, and that meant it was either something very powerful or a normal human being who meant ill will. I grabbed George by the arm and said, "Come on, we have to get to my house." "What?" he asked, seeing the strain on my face. "Something's wrong," I said as I was overwhelmed by a horrific odor of death and decay around us. And then, out of the shadows of a nearby building, 4 men charged. I didn't need my mage sight to know what they were. They were the walking dead, revenants with a directed will. They moved like their limbs were stiff or were on strings being pulled by some unseen puppeteer. Yet they were not slow, but moved with an unnatural speed. Although their hair ran a gamut from black to blonde, they were all covered in some dark powder that gave it their skin an eerie cast. Their faces were sunken and clung to the bones as if there was no muscle left beneath it. Their forms were angular and gaunt as if they'd been starved for many weeks. And they were onto us before I could recover from the backlash created by the assault on my wards, and so I was slow to react. I felt myself torn away from George by all four and twisted hard against their inhuman strength. They completely ignored my companion and concentrated their attack on me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw George picking himself up from the ground as he reached into his jacket just before one of the bodies blocked my view. And shaking my head, I tried to clear my thoughts as the men clawed at me, their fingers trying to sink into my skin. As one grabbed me about the face, I felt a chill from the contact, and struggling to get my bearings and regain control of myself, I threw my attackers from me and growled. I felt my body shift into my natural form and deployed my claws as the tiger deep in my soul began to take over my mind and body. The vast majority of time, we mage cats are not susceptible to our beast within, as we're born shapeshifting. However, in times of great emotional turmoil, like the death of a loved one, or when our minds are not at full capacity, as I was now, it could and would sometimes take over when threatened. I felt my clothes begin to rip as the tiger roared to demonstrate its dominance. I didn't take my full battle height, but I could feel myself growing as the world became brighter around me. My mind shifted down to something more primal, more infra than ultra, more animal than man, as the tiger's mind shielded me from the assault on my wards. As if from a dream, I watched as my body lashed out at the attacking revenants with full strength and claw. They seemed to show no fear as they continuously charged me, only to have their limbs ripped from their bloodless bodies, bones to be snapped in two or to be eviscerated with a single blow. My tiger was not pulling his punches but was instead carrying out my lady's commission. A singular backhand caught one of the undead attackers in the chest and held him straight back with so much force that his body tore through a nearby automobile. Some part of my mind registered that it was mine. As the revenant picked himself up and charged back towards me, I heard the sound of gunfire begin to echo off the buildings. I watched as the head of the creature exploded in a rain of bloodless brains and then slumped it against the green-painted remains of the LaSalle. I turned to see George holding the gun. His face was pale and his eyes were wide. He looked at me, looked at the gun, and smiled wanly. I could smell his fear. Even in the more animal state of my mind, his form, his scent registered as friend or ally, if not streak. I turned from him and headed off into the copse of woods on the other side of the parking lot and towards the direction of the source of my pain. In other words, towards where my wards had been shattered. And it was the last thing I remembered that night. I awoke the next morning naked and covered in muddy soot and ash as a fireman was checking my pulse. Behind him, I could see the sun coming up over the little peninsula at Burnt House Point. I looked around and realized that I was next to the water's edge, where the tunnel of my hidden room came out. I could see the tracks where he had come through the tunnel, as if searching for survivors. "Hey, somebody get the duck over here," he yelled. "Looks like he survived." And turning back to look down at me, he said, "Looks like you crawled out of a fire, naked." And shaking my head, I sat up and immediately regretted it. "What fire?" I asked. "Your house. It burned down last night. Looks like you barely made it out alive," he said, pulling his jacket off and wrapping it around my shoulders. Fire? I asked, my head still full of cobwebs. I hurt all over, and it was a deep soul-wrenching hurt. I reached out for my wards and found them shattered, destroyed and erased. And since they had been built using my own blood, my own energy, their destruction had backlashed into my body, which in a way was good because it made me look like hell. Suddenly, 2 men came over the small rise leading up to the pine copse between me, the hidden lantern, and the house. I recognized the bald pate of Mr. Babcock, Jimmy's dad, as one of them. He looked very upset. The other was a younger man in his late 20s or early 30s. He was actually quite handsome, with a pate of unruly blonde hair and grey eyes. He was carrying a traditional doctor's black bag and was covered in soot. Not far behind them was a worried-looking George. I vaguely remembered the attack at the school and wondered how that got explained away. I guess my confusion and my appearance was just what was needed to explain how I survived a fire like that. I still had no idea what had happened. "Are you okay?" the doctor asked as he began to examine me. I shrugged and said, "I hurt," and it was the truth. Pain and I were not very good acquaintances, at least this kind of bone-deep pain. I never get sick. I heal from what few injuries I do receive rather quickly, excepting those, of course, inflicted by Amber, and I'm damn hard to hurt as it is. "No doubt," he replied as he took a stethoscope and checked my heart and breathing. "Cough," he told me. I did as bade and smiled. "I hope you aren't gonna pull out a glove and ask me to turn my head and do that here on the beach." He frowned over at me and said, "If I thought it was necessary, but unless you are feeling pain there, I think we can skip that exam." I nodded and said, "I feel pain all over." "That's probably a reaction to the adrenaline when you crawled out of the house," he said. "From the looks of things, you had to fight your way down the basement to get out. Place went up fast." I nodded and wondered exactly what he was talking about. I didn't know how anybody with a supernatural intent could get in to burn the place down. Mr. Babcock looked at me and asked, "Are you okay, Win?" I smiled over at him and said, "I'm fine, sir. Just a little confused." "There's no wonder at that," he said. "The place is a complete loss. The fire chief says it looks like the oil tank for your furnace exploded and took out most of the ground floor." "So the house is a total loss?" I asked. He nodded and frowned, saying, "Looks that way. Several of the outbuildings are still standing and the safe is okay, although it came through the floor and is now in the basement. Looks like the door may be warped. We'll probably have to hire someone to cut it open." I laughed at the thought of hiring someone to break into my own safe. The doctor gave me a strange look, so I smiled at him and said, "It's either a laugh or a cry, Doc. Which would you prefer?" He grinned over at Mr. Babcock and said, "I can't find anything wrong with him that a bath, a hot meal, and a set of clothes won't cure." "Guess I'll be checking into the local hotel then," I said. "You'll do no such thing," Mr. Babcock said. "You'll come and stay with me until we get something else worked out." I shook my head and said, "Thank you for the kind offer, Mr. Babcock, but I think under the circumstances, it would be best if I stayed at a hotel." I hoped he'd get the message. He made to reply, but he seemed to think for a moment longer and finally said, "I'll make arrangements for you to stay at the Colonial." I smiled at him and said, "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." From then, things turned to a haze until I had a chance to settle down. It was a couple of days later, after several obligatory visits from my friends, that George approached me about what happened at the college. I had been out to the house once to look over things and ensure that the skull was there where I'd left it, which it was. so I knew that he and several others were picking through the rubble. He was nervous and I could tell he was out of sorts. As we sat at a table in the dining room of the hotel, I said, "Spit it out, George." He grinned and asked, "Am I that obvious?" To someone who's been around you for a while, yeah, I told him as I picked at my eggs. "Well, we were going through the rubble around the house and I found something. I didn't want to turn it over to the buttons because I was afraid they may think you had something to do with the explosion," he said quietly. "What did you find?" I asked him, my heart sinking to my feet. That was the last thing I needed to have had happen. "It was part of a wooden box. On it was stamped Spartan Explosive Company, 25 pounds TNT, shipped to Coal Creek Mines, WV," he whispered to me. "Didn't you tell me you had a mine in West Virginia you needed to check out?" George knew I was wealthy. He'd asked about it not long after we'd met. I don't think he understands just how much I'm worth, but he knows I'm worth a whole lot more than I let on. I nodded and said, "Yeah, according to the reports I'm getting out of it, the profit margin is just a little too high." He said, "I don't know how much you remember about that attack, but the things that jumped us." He swallowed hard and turned just a little green around the edges. "Jumped you were dressed as miners. Joe says they were something called revenants." I nodded and asked, "And how did Joe get involved in this?" "I had to call someone to help cover up the fact that your car had been smashed and there were 4 dead bodies in the parking lot of Midvale College," he said. "He and Martin did a good job of covering it up and getting the police off the case." I nodded. I knew that the recondite order had connections in half the police forces around DC. That favor probably cost Joe a pretty penny. I smiled and said, "I owe to both of you, and Joe." He shook his head and said, "No, that was just partial repayment for what you did to save Eddie and the rest of us, not to mention what you're doing about Jimmy." I smiled and said, "That's what my faith is all about, George. When we give gifts or do favors for each other, we strengthen the ties between us." He nodded and frowned. "Do you know what this attack was all about?" he asked. "I have a good idea. Jimmy sent me something that Miss Lemec, she wants back." "Did they get it?" he asked worriedly. I shook my head and said, "No. I think that's why they blew the house up. They were hoping to shatter my wards, which they did, and so they could find it. But there are other things than just those wards hiding it." "Do I want to know?" he asked. Probably not," I told him. "What do you want to do about the crate?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "I think I need to check out that mine now more than ever. Is there a connection? And if so, what?" He smiled and said, "I thought you'd say something like that. Eddie and I have arranged to get some time off. Actually, for me, it's a working holiday. I'm going to be doing some surveying for the Department of Interior about running roads through there." I nodded and said, "Good. The experience will probably come in handy someday." I didn't tell him that he was being set up to become a major player in the WPA. "When did we leave?" I asked, realizing that he'd already made plans. "This Saturday," he told me. "Get your gear packed and I'm taking a trip to visit my grandfather's home tomorrow to hide something, and then I'll be ready to go." The Feline Factor 2. The Horned Skull. Chapter 3. Let's get straight into that. Getting things together for our camping trip turned out to be easier than expected. Eddie had already got a list put together and gathered a lot of the equipment we'd need. I purchased a couple of good tents, or at least as good as you could get in the 30s, and the supplies we would need. We were at my place, or at least what was left of it, packing up the gear. As we loaded it all into the back of the Ford pickup I'd bought for this trip, I watched my companions carefully. George, of course, knew what was going on, but I hadn't heard anything about Eddie knowing. "Has George talked to you about the reasons we're going on this trip?" I asked. Eddie grinned up at me with eyes of jade and said, "We're going after the bitch who killed Jimmy." I raised an eyebrow at his comments and said, "Yeah, but I'm afraid it's likely to be the same kind of situation that we had with Lucy." He shook his head and said, "No, not this time." Then they were just planning on killing us. This time, they managed to actually do it. I'm not going to let that slide. "How much has George told you?" I asked. That somebody called Ilu got into Jimmy's head and started him to thinking crazy things. That they killed him because he wanted out and made it look like he hung himself. That they sent some kind of walking dead to kill you and blew up your house, he said, hefting a large pack onto the back of the truck and then picked up the Henry 44 rimfire and lay it into the back of the truck alongside the pack. I took a moment to admire the weapon. My dad said his dad described it as that Yankee gun you could load on Sunday and shoot it all week long. It had some good knockdown power and was about as quick firing as a gun as you could get without going into semi-automatic. "For bear?" I asked. "That'll work," he said with a grin as he grabbed another load to put on the truck. "Eddie, you do realize how dangerous this is, don't you?" I asked. He stopped and looked me in the eye. "I'm not stupid, Win. I know what we're dealing with, and creatures like Lucy. That's one of the reasons I'm glad Dot and Betty decided to stay behind. I don't want to be worrying about them when we take these palookas down." I nodded and put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Then you understand why I'm worried about you," I told him. He shook his head once and said with his usual defiance and confidence, "The difference is that I'm not a skirt. I can take care of myself." "I'm not questioning your manhood, Eddie. I just want to make sure all my friends come back in one piece. I don't want to bury any more of them," I told him. "Don't you worry about me none, Wing Greenbow. You just help me watch out for George. I hear he's a little soft when it comes to being outdoors." "Really?" I asked. "Yep. He told me he's never been camping before, at least not deep in the woods," he replied as I loaded the extra canisters of fuel into the back of the truck. We were heading deep into the backwoods of West Virginia, and I had no idea how far it would be between filling stations. Eddie looked at the canisters and asked, "You realize we have a wreck and those things get punctured, we'll go up like a Roman candle, don't you?" I nodded and said, "I know, but I don't want to run out of gas somewhere back in the mountains and not be able to get out." "Have you thought about what you're going to do if we do find this Zilla Lamech in the West by God, Virginia?" he asked. I grinned at his use of popular expression and nodded. "I'm going to take them down, Eddie. I'm going to make sure that they know that I won't stand by and let them hurt my friends. If they're up to something worse, then I'll deal with that too. Remember what I told you guys back after the mess with Lucy? I stand between humanity and those that were free and chained." Eddie stopped and put his hands on his hips and asked, "Exactly what does that mean, Win? You going to go after anybody who starts making noises about conquering the world or something?" I nodded, thinking of that madman in Germany who, within a few months, gained a majority in the Reichstag. "Yeah, something like that," I said. "It means that my lady has given me the mission to make sure that mankind chooses its own destiny and isn't dominated by beings like Lucy or these Alu. We don't interfere with anybody who is just living their lives, but when they move to hurt people, we're supposed to step in." "I'm afraid you're going to be dancing a jig before this is all over, Win," he said. I shrugged and told him, maybe, but we've been doing it since before the Israelites were wandering in the desert, and I suspect we'll be doing it long after mankind has left for the stars. You think we'll eventually get to the other planets? He asked. Eddie was a devourer of any science fiction and fantasy. I just hit on his favourite subject. Yeah, eventually, I told him. I'm not sure that we haven't already been there, but I've just forgotten. Now you do sound like that Edgar Rice Burroughs fella, he said with a grin. I've read him, I said, and several others as well. Our tastes in literature aren't that different, my friend. I know, he said with a grin. You just wear it better than I do. I laughed and said, maybe so, my friend, maybe so. But remember, when the claws come out, I want you and George out of the way. I don't want to see you hurt. The Alu are stronger than normal men, and I bet they're harder to hurt. I won't let you down, Win, he said. And I won't let them get away with killing Jimmy. I nodded as I realized he wouldn't be deterred. He wanted a piece of the Elu, and I couldn't blame him. Still, it would make my job that much harder. Well, keep the Henry close. Will do, he said, grinning. The trip into the Allegheny Mountains and then deep into the Appalachians was bumpy at best, and at times downright dangerous. Even in my time, those mountains were rough terrain, and the roads were winding and steep. In the early 30s they were nearly non-existent, and what would have been a trip only a few hours turned into a 3-day journey. We stayed our first night out in a small boarding house in Guard Gap at the Virginia side of the state line. The food was good, and the owner was glad to have paying customers, so she treated us well. She even sent us the next morning with a batch of biscuits wrapped in an old flour sack. The crossover at the state line was startling. The paved road ended abruptly, and we found ourselves on a rutted gravel road that shook us around in a cab at the ford, like dice in a gambler's hand. It was everything I could do not to keep us moving at times, as there were areas where the road had completely washed away. It was a rough day, and we only made it half as far that day as we did the first. When the sun finally set, we ended up camping on the side of the road, which was sort of what we were planning to do in the first place. It was a pleasant night, and I genuinely enjoyed being out under the stars as the full moon rose over the Allegheny Mountains. Eddie and George kept shooting me quick glances and then would look up at the moon. And finally, I leaned back and, laughing, said, I'm not going to shift on you tonight, boys. I'm in complete control. And both of them blushed in my direct comment, and Eddie asked, "Were that obvious?" I nodded my head and said, "You look like you were expecting me to shift into my battle form and head off into the night." I stopped and looked at each of them and said, "You are aware that I recognize both of you as friends no matter what form I'm in, or even what state of mind I'm in." I turned to George and said, "Remember when they blew my house up? Even then, when the cat was running things, I recognized you as an ally. I didn't attack." And George nodded and said, "I wondered about that." He stopped and looked at me and said, "Win, would you mind telling us about what you are? Maybe then we can understand where you're coming from. When you shifted that evening, it was completely different from when you fought Lucy's men. I mean, then you were almost playful in the way you looked, mostly human with fur, and a cat's tail and ears. But when you fought those creatures, you went to something completely different." I nodded. I had wondered which one of them would eventually ask about these things. It was a testament to how much they trusted me, in that they'd waited this long. I sighed, sipped my coffee, and leaned back against a stump. Okay, well, first off, I'm not a were-tiger. "But," Eddie interrupted. I raised a hand and said, "I'm a mage cat, although I take the form of a tiger, ranging from the size of a house cat all the way up to a Siberian tiger or even my battle form. None of them are my true form, the form I was born in. You weren't born looking like you do now? Eddie asked, and I shook my head and said, no, I was born looking pretty close to this, but with a cat's ears, a tail, and whiskers. I didn't bother to tell them that I was actually born of a woman, but instead I was cloned in one of the UN's illegal facilities, and that would take too much explaining to do. That is my natural form. My mother taught me to look normal, completely human, almost from birth, I told them. Was your mama a mage cat? Eddie asked, and I shook my head and said, no, my mom was an elf, a Nordic elf. She was a natural shapeshifter too, and could look like anyone she wanted to. She could read minds and cast magic spells as well. It made it easier for her to teach me. And Dad, he was a mage cat. What's the difference between a mage cat and a were tiger? George asked. Although some were cats, usually a higher percentage of them than other shifters, may have the mage gift and can cast spells, they can only do it while human. I can do it in any form I take. That is that gift from Freya. I smiled. Among other things. Are there any drawbacks? Eddie asked. I mean, like werewolves and silver. I chuckled and said, you have no idea how many times I've been asked that. First off, although silver would affect the vast majority of werewolves, it won't affect all of them. Some, the true breeds, will only get angry if you stab them or shoot them with silver. As for me, I'm not affected by it at all. There is something that I'm affected by, but I won't tell you what it is. Why not? George asked. Although I trust you, I don't trust the Elu not to be able to pick it out of your minds. I lied. You told Joe there were 9 of you, George said. I nodded and said, there are only supposed to be 9 of us at a time. I was sort of an accident, so there were some arrangements that had to be made. A deal with me being the 10th. My being sent to Colonial Bay is part of that. So you've been sent here as some kind of punishment or for something you didn't do? Eddie asked. I shook my head and said, no, I was sent here because you need me here. If I don't deal with these things that I've been sent to deal with, then the world will be in a lot of hurt. But outside of Lucy, all you've done so far is work your ass off in school, Eddie said. I nodded and replied, I remember, I'm not supposed to interfere with normal humans or even with what Martin calls the dark breed, unless they're doing something to hurt common folks or the balance of power. About this magic thing, Eddie said. Yeah, I asked. How useful was it? He asked. Can anybody do it? I shook my head and said, no. There is a type of magic that anyone can do. It's called sorcery. And it's one point on which the recondite order and I agree. Practitioners of it need to be dealt with immediately. How is it different? George asked. Sorcery is the practice of summoning demons, devils and other spirits and making vile pacts with them for power. It usually involves the spilling of blood. It's not the kind of thing we want to encourage, I told them. I would say not, George replied. But what you do isn't sorcery? Eddie asked. And I shook my head and said, what I do is magic. There are some basic principles that it all follows, but in the end the power comes from my own personal energy. Too much and I get tired. I didn't tell them the addition of the transhuman genes that I have gave me an endurance beyond most other mages or even mage cats. To be honest, I think the only mage cat who could truly go toe-to-toe with either myself or Trey was Leaf Hunter, and his mother was Our Lady. Magic comes from inside of us. Sorcery comes from another source. I think that's why the recondite order is so rabid. They think that all the magic comes from sorcery. So, you're not gonna turn into that thing I saw a couple of weeks ago? George asked. I looked at him and said, that thing? That's me, George. He blushed slightly and said,
I guess I could have said that a little better.
Probably, I told him, with a smile to show that there were no hard feelings. Okay, let me ask you something else, Eddie said. Shoot, I replied. When's there going to be a dame on your side? I've watched you for almost 4 years now, and I haven't seen you chase a single skirt for more than a few weeks. I smiled and said, I borrowed from the first President Roosevelt's attitude. Which is? He asked. Catch and release, I told him. I'm not looking to settle down. I know a few people that, when we want to scratch an itch, we take care of each other, I said. Who? Eddie pressed. I shook my head and told him, I'm sorry, I won't go telling secrets out of school. My dad taught me better than that, and I really don't want to have to explain that on occasion. Those friends weren't always female. Let's just say that when I was younger, growing up in Europe, we had an expression, friends with benefits. Eddie raised an eyebrow and said, That's rather metropolitan of you. I shook my head and replied, I never said it wasn't. None of us want to settle down, but sometimes we like to play, so we give each other a call. We own under score and don't want to put any pressure on anyone else more than a good night and maybe dinner and a movie. Sometimes it's just somebody to talk to.
You're one strange man, Win Greenbow,
George said. So you guys keep telling me, I replied. But I'm me. I live my life on my terms.
So, what are we going to do tomorrow when we get to the mine?
George asked. Look around first, look around town, restock our supplies. I want to keep the tank and those extra cans full on the truck. We might have to move fast and for a long time, and I want to make sure that we've got the fuel to do it. I'm going to the mine to check over the books. Something is just wrong about the whole setup. I'm all for the making of profit, but when that kind of margin is coming in, it usually means somebody is cooking the books, and that kind of thing could blow up in my face.
You think Miss Lamech is going to be there?
George asked. I'm not sure. She hasn't found what she's looking for, I told him. She could be back in Washington or even Colonial Bay looking for it. And what is she looking for? Eddie asked. A skull, I told him. A skull? Like somebody's noggin? The redhead asked. I laughed. Not just anybody's noggin. This one had a set of horns sticking out about 6 or 7 inches from each eye. It's also slightly larger than just anybody's noggin, and its eye sockets glow with a hateful light that reaches into your brain and tries to control you. George whistled and asked,
And this is what they were trying to get when they killed Jimmy?
I nodded and said, Yep.
You know where it is?
He asked. I nodded. Where? Eddie wanted to know. I shook my head and said, It's best if you don't know. If you don't know, then they can't pick it out of your thoughts. What about your thoughts, Win? Mine are a bit harder. My mom was a telepath. When I realized that they had no idea what that meant, I explained. She could read minds. She taught me how to protect my mind. Can you read minds? Eddie asked, suddenly worried. I shook my head and said, No, but I've learned to tell when someone is trying to read mine and how to block them. It's a lot of work, and I usually would rather not have to worry about it. That's one of the reasons that Lucy couldn't control me. I smiled and looked at George and added, That and the fact that there were far more interesting things to look at when we met. And George chuckled and said, You're right there. I can't believe I took my eyes off that rack to look at her face and she had me. She was new to her power. I'm not sure that trick would work now, I said. Where do you think she is now? Eddie asked. I'm not sure. I suspect somewhere in New York, Boston or Chicago. Vampires lose themselves in cities with big populations. That way, the occasional body showing up isn't as big of a news as it would have been in Colonial Bay. The other two nodded, and George said,
I think I'm gonna turn in now. I'm sore and tired. I don't think you managed to miss a single hole in the road so far, Win.
I smiled and made a rude gesture at him. He just chuckled, shook his head, and looked over to Eddie before turning in. I could tell he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Good idea, Eddie replied as he walked over and started banking the fire. He reached inside the truck and pulled out a pail of sand and set it nearby, and with a wink he added, just in case. I nodded and said, I'll be up for a while longer. I'm not that sleepy. George called out from the tent and said,
I just don't want to hear about somebody's cattle getting mauled by a tiger in the middle of the night tomorrow.
I laughed and said, I promise, no cattle mutilations. The next day found us moving deeper into the mountains of West Virginia. All of the photographs I'd seen of this country had been in black and white, and to be honest, pardon the pun, but they coloured my impressions of what it should be. Living it in colour and living glory of the springtime in these mountains was a completely different experience. Yes, we'd travelled through areas of crushing poverty, and there were the occasional shacks where a family far too large for the structure struggled to scratch a life out of the thin mountain soil. Yes, a great many of the people we met there were shoeless, or their clothes were converted flour sacks. But at the same time, there really was a quiet dignity to them. They prided themselves on giving an honest day's work for honest pay. But when we entered into the small town of Cold Creek, I felt something different. Here, the poverty pressed against more than just the people. It pressed against their souls. I could feel something wrong here in the overly gaunt faces. Many of them moved as if they had no mind of their own, or had just lost all hope of any salvation. The sense I got from more than one of them told me that they would not survive more than a few more days of this existence. Something was poisoning the town. I looked at George and Eddie and said, try to avoid eating anything here in town. When? Don't you think these people have anything to eat for themselves, much less share with us? Eddie said. I know, I told him, but I think something is poisoning them. They don't look right, they don't smell right, and they don't feel right.
I don't need the senses of a cat to tell that, Win,
George said.
There's definitely something wrong here, and I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts that Lamech and the Elu have something to do with it.
I think you're probably right there, George. Still, I worry about you guys. Stop worrying, Win, Eddie berated me. We're big boys. We can take care of ourselves. I nodded and pulled up to the Cabell's Cold Creek General Store. Wait here, guys. I'm going to get some directions to the mine. I walked into the cool darkness of the store, and the first smell that hit was that of rotting vegetables. I looked over to the rows of bins and saw several rats sitting along them. A woman with a gaunt face and bloated body stood behind the counter, staring at some of the distant spots on the far wall. I got the feeling that whatever was inside her was no longer human. And screwed up my courage, I asked, Can you direct me to the Cold Creek mine?
Who wants to know?
She asked harshly, as if her voice had not been used in some time. The owner, I told her.
Owner's dead, back east,
the woman said sadly. I shook my head and said, Not hardly. One of the best parts about being sent back in time was that I got to steal all the good lines before they're ever used.
Old owner's dead,
the woman repeated.
New owner took possession last week.
I raised an eyebrow and asked again, Can you direct me to the mine? And she nodded her head and said,
Just follow the railroad. It leads right to the mine.
I nodded and said, Thanks.
I wouldn't go out there, young man,
she said.
Folks who go out there come back changed. You won't like the change. They won't like you.
I nodded and said, I'd take my chances. Then, stopping, I wove a rune in the dust on the window and sang a small spell. You will forget that I was here. Her eyes flew open, her voice changed to something deep and ominous.
Those words, that song. You're the scion of summer, Gulstadir.
I turned and looked at her in surprise. How did she know my mother's name? And suddenly, outside, the horn on the truck began to beep. I looked outside to see where all the people in the streets had dropped everything they were doing and turned towards the store. Many of them carried makeshift weapons in their hands, and none of them looked like they wanted to discuss the recent trade between St. Louis Browns and the Washington Senators. All of them had a cold, dead look on their face that made me wonder if they were even alive. When George was laying on the horn of the truckers, Eddie was standing on the running board fumbling with the packs in the back, looking for the Henry, I was sure. As I came down the short set of steps leading up to the front of the store, someone grabbed at me. I spun down with my fist drawn back to look in the face of a kid that couldn't be older than 9 or 10. He or she, I couldn't tell which it was through the dirt and grime and under the floppy hat. I cringed back and stopped myself from taking the swing.
Take me away with you,
the child hissed.
Please.
Like I said, there are times when we are guided by that inner compass Our Lady instilled in us. This was one of those times. I scooped him up, or her up, and tossed them too. Skinny child into the cab of the truck with George and yelled at Eddie, "Hang on! This is gonna be rough." Well, thankfully, George had already started to Ford, so I slammed the door shut, hid the clutch and slammed it in reverse, and accelerated backwards. At least one of the creatures, for I was beginning to realize that my horror that this whole town was made up of the same creatures who'd attacked me in Colonial Bay, got clipped hard. I heard an awful sound as they fell under the tires, and there was no cry of pain, just the horrible sounds of bones crunching beneath the weight of the vehicle. I slammed the truck into first and gunned the engine, letting off the clutch simultaneously. I had timed my double clutch just right, and we shot ahead and started gaining speed down the road in the direction that the shopkeeper had indicated for the mine.
What you going this here way for?
The child in the seat between George and me screamed.
This is where they take it to kill you.
And George gave the kid a startled look and asked,
"We're open to suggestions. We can't go back, kid."
I watched the road, but I could almost feel the kid's mind working for an option.
Up ahead. That's a dirt road. If you can drive this thing, then take it. It goes up a ways the mountain. They don't like none of that up there.
"Who are you?"
George asked as I yanked the wheel hard to the right and downshifted to handle the rising grade. The kid wasn't kidding about needing to know how to drive. The road was narrow, rutted, and within 100 yards started forming a sheer drop-off on the right as the little valley fell away sharply. The kid turned to look at George and said, "Name's Willie Thomas."
"And how come you're not one of those things back there then, Willie?"
George asked a question that was on my mind. The kid laughed, pointed to the dirt-covered overall front with his equally dirt-covered thumb, and said proudly, "Because I'm faster, I'm smarter than they are." And he grinned and added, "And because I'm smart enough to get into places they can't."
"Well, Willie, that was either brave or foolish of you back there. If you were safe and good at running, then why didn't you stay hidden?"
George asked. Before the boy could answer, there was a low grumble from his stomach. He frowned and said, "Because them things don't eat. And worstest yet, they let a good food rot. I was trying to find me something to eat. I figured I could maybe catch a ride with you fellas and get out of here before they got to me." I nodded to the flour sack on the floor next to George's feet. "I think there's some biscuits left in there. They're a couple of days old, but they can hold you over until we find some place to stop and make camp." He started to grab for the sack, but then stopped and seemed to remember his manners.
Thank you right kindly, mister."
I smiled as I concentrated on the road. "Where are your folks?" I asked. And from the corner of my eye, I caught the flash of pain across his face before he said,
"Miners took 'em. I was down fishing in the creek when they came and got 'em. Next time I see 'em, they were like that. Mama tried to catch me. I ran and been running since."
He tore into the biscuit with a gusto of someone who was starving. "Is there a place up here we can camp? Some place defensible?" And the boy nodded and said,
"They don't none like it much up here. Dunno what it is, but they don't come up here. I've been hiding out in the old Turner's place. They packed up and moved to Guinea last fall."
"Guinea?"
George asked.
"Who is she?"
And the boy gave George a disbelieving look.
"Not who. Where? Guinea, Old Dominion. You know, east of here."
And the light dawned on George's face.
"You mean Virginia?"
And the boy got a defiant look on his face and said,
"I mean what I said, mister. You call it that, we call it Guinea."
There was a pounding on the cab of the truck, and I pounded back, yelling out the window, "Let me find a safe place to stop." Eddie pounded his understanding with 2 quick raps, and I looked for a wide place in the road to stop and see what he needed. We had to travel nearly another mile before the road wound out into a small plateau that looked out over the town below. I pulled the truck back where the drop-off below gave it some cover from possible rifle fire from down below. My family was far from rural Alabama, and so I knew just how deadly these mountains folk could be with a long gun. I knew a great many of them who'd gone off to the Great War came home with their Enfields and Springfields and didn't want to give them a clear shot. As I pulled the truck over and out of the way, I felt the weight of the truck shift and Eddie dropped down. There was a low growl and then the bark of a Henry. I came out of the truck at full tilt, only to find one of the Draoug lying on the ground, half of his head missing. Eddie was cocking a Henry's lever forward to chamber another round.
"He hung on all the way up the road."
I looked over to the short redhead and smiled. "How did you keep him from climbing into the bed with you?" He bent down and pulled up his right pant leg to reveal several deep scratches.
"I kicked him in the head."
He shook his head and said,
"Damn, they're strong."
I nodded and started to rummage through the packs looking for the first aid kit. And finding it, I said, "Let me put something on that." And with the help of my mum and sister-in-law, I had managed to stock it with stuff from my own time that I knew was going to be more effective than what was available in the 30s. But for this, I figured I'd start with the basics. I pulled out a small bottle of rubbing alcohol and said, This is gonna sting." He nodded and said,
Just put it on. I'm not a baby."
I tucked my head with a smile and poured it down his leg and then grabbed his ankle to make sure that he couldn't pull it back until all the alcohol had soaked into the deep gashes. He struggled against my grip for a second and I heard him make a small painful noises. And finally, I looked back over my shoulder to see both George and Willie staring at me. I caught George's eye and then looked at Willie, and he understood. "Come on, Willie. Give me a hand getting this stuff straightened up so we won't lose it." When I was sure that the kid wasn't looking, I popped a claw and drew a rune in my palm with my own blood. And singing a spell, I pressed my palm to Eddie's leg and watched the wounds begin to close. He looked down at me and growled.
"Was that necessary?"
I grinned at him as I stood. Yeah, it was. I wanted to make sure those wounds don't get infected. I turned and pointed to the dead thing on the ground and said, "There's no telling what that thing's nails carry." I then grinned at him and said, "Like I said, I watch out for my friends."
"It's all secured, Win,"
George called from the truck. I knew there was as much a question there as there was a comment. "Good." Patting Eddie on the shoulder here, I added, "I think our sharpshooter here is gonna live." Eddie smiled sheepishly and then, when he was sure that the boy wasn't looking, pulled his pants leg slightly to show that deep gouges had already faded to nasty red welts. I knew they had to burn like hell, though.
Good,
George said, jumping down from the back of the Ford and then helping the boy down. Setting him on the ground, he said,
Boy, you need some meat on your bones.
Willie looked up at him defiantly and said, I've been working on it. How far is it to this Turner place? I asked Willie. He pointed to the top of the ridge about a mile away. It's up there. He stopped for a moment and looked at me before saying, But I warn you, the Turners, they were witch people. I think that's why them things won't go up there. There's a fear of something up there. I nodded and said, Well, maybe we can use that. Let's get moving. I want to make it up there and look around and pick your brain for some information. Maybe set up a base of operation. And the boy, he gave me a strange look and asked, You a government man? I shook my head and said, No, I'm not the revenue either. I own the mine. I came to check it out. According to that general store, a new owner bought it from the last new owner, he said. And I crossed my arms and asked, And who is the new owner? Somebody named Lamech, he replied. George, Eddie and I looked at each other before I said, Not hardly.
Maybe she thinks you're dead and nobody will come looking for a while,
George said. I can't imagine them not knowing I'm still alive. Surely they aren't that stupid that they won't follow up to make sure they did the job. You talking like you know this Lamech guy, Willie said. I never met her, I told him. But she did try to have me killed by sending a bunch of those Jarorgs after me. That's what they're called? He asked. I nodded and said, Close as I can tell, they're a form of walking dead that the ancient Vikings used to fear. Vikings? Ain't they some kind of old world bad guys or something? Willie asked. I smiled at him and said, Or something. And this woman tried to kill you? He looked me up and down and said, You look awful spry to be been attacked by a bunch of them things. I laughed and told him, I'm harder to kill than I look. He just nodded and said, A real tough guy, huh?
Kid, you have no idea,
George said.
Now, let's get back on the road so we can figure out what to do next.
As we continued to head up the mountain, an idea came to mind. Willie might be the perfect thing I needed to keep George and Eddie out of the worst of it. If I made him their responsibility, then he was just likely to be slippery enough to keep them occupied. The danger in that was, if he was too slippery, then he could get himself and them killed. It was something to think about. An hour later, when we pulled into the Turner place, I could feel the magic around the place. Maybe there was something to what Willie said about them being witch folk. A term I knew was sometimes applied to people in the mountains who had a touch of magic or PSI to them. The house was not what I was expecting. Although there were lines running to it, there was obviously no electricity to it now. But it was well built, unpainted clapboard home that had long since turned to a silver grey, another rundown shack that I was expecting. A large sandstone chimney stood at either end, and there was a nearby stream of water as a source. Evidently, the Turners had a substantial source of income. When I first heard the story of them packing up and leaving, I thought it was due to the depression, but it seemed like they were doing okay for themselves. I turned to Willie and asked, Why did the Turners say they were leaving? Willie shrugged his shoulders and said, I never heard from them myself, but I overheard Mr. Grandin down at the store tell my pa that they told him that something bad was coming, and they didn't want to be here for it. George turned and asked,
Could they have heard about the Alu?
I shrugged and said, Some of these mountain folk have a real mage talent. They may have sensed it and decided to move on instead of staying and fighting against something they couldn't stop. So where does that leave us? Eddie asked. That leaves us right where we started before. I'm going to slip into the mine this evening and see what I can find out. You and George are going to keep an eye on Willie for me and get the gear ready for a possible assault.
You expecting them to attack up here?
Willie asked. I shook my head and said, no, I mean us possibly having to assault them. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. He shook his head and a dirty blonde lock of hair fell out from under his hat. As he shoved it up under his cap, I asked, Willie, is that short for Wilhelmina? This was getting better and better. And the kid looked at me in shock and started to say something. I fixed her with my gaze and let just a little of the tiger surface. She looked down and nodded and said,
How do you know?
What?
George demanded.
You're a girl?
He shook his head and said, coming out of the outhouse.
I'm glad I decided to wait until I got here instead of us using a tree.
The girl pulled her hat off and long blonde hair poured out from under it. It was a definite need of a wash and a trim.
How did you know?
I smiled and said, the way you shoved your hair back up under your hat, a boy would have let it fall out and not worry about it. She just nodded and asked,
What you gonna do now? Put me in a dress and make me take a bath?
I smiled and said, not in that order, and not now. Seems to me this has worked out for you pretty well so far, and kept you alive. My mum used to tell me, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I nodded and said, but if we can find your relatives before we leave this area, I'm taking you with me back to... I paused for a moment and smiled, saying, back to Guinea. I'm not going to leave you up here on this mountain to die of starvation or privation.
I can take care of myself,
she protested. I nodded and said, as best as I can tell, that's not in question. But I have a duty to protect people, and leaving you here wouldn't be fulfilling that duty.
Well, I'm not wearing a dress,
she demanded. I raised an eyebrow and said, I didn't say you had to. Yet, we'll talk about this later. In the meantime, I want to get our base of operations set up here. I plan on moving out tonight to do some reconnaissance. Maybe take a deer or something to provide us with a bit of extra protein in case this turns into a siege situation. Now, give us a hand with the supplies. Well, for some reason, that simple statement did more to calm her racing heart than anything I think I could have said. Both George and Eddie kept giving me strange looks. I think they thought I'd taken complete leave of my senses. Exactly what they thought I had in mind, I don't know. But I had a plan. Sort of. As I began pulling packs off the truck, Eddie stepped up close to me and asked, Exactly what are you planning, Win? Well, like I said, I'm going out for some reconnaissance to get the lay of the land. Also, I want to bring down a deer. If this turns into a siege situation, I'd rather us have plenty of strength to fight them off. About watching after the girl, he said. I'm making her yours and George's responsibility, I said. Who put you in charge? He demanded. You did the moment you agreed to tag along with me, knowing what I was doing, I told him. She's gonna be more trouble than she's worth, he protested. I turned to look at him and said, She's a child. How could you say something like that? She may be able to take care of herself, but how long do you think she was really going to last against Lamech and her drogs? Eventually, she'd have been caught. I smiled and said, besides, she knows the lay of the land, and has her own survival skills. And by saddling her with me and George, you can keep us occupied while you handle the dangerous stuff, he said. I smiled and said, there is that, but to be honest, I'm hoping that the survival skills she's developed living on her own here for a while will keep us all alive. I'm not going to waste good resources, and as far as I'm concerned, she's a gift from my goddess. You have a funny attitude about women, Win, he said. So I've been told, I replied. But you're starting to develop it too. What do you mean? He asked. You're starting to see them as real human beings. Just look at Dot. Let's leave Dot out of this, he said, clenching his fists. Let's not, I told him. I have nothing but good things to say about her. She's strong, she's smart, and she's pretty. I think she's the perfect match for you. You're also starting to realize that she has something to add to the world, other than being somebody's wife. That's very... I paused and smiled, and threw his own word back at him. Metropolitan of you. I think you're likely to be willing to listen to a warning coming from Willie, even if it is from a girl. He shrugged and blushed. She's lived here all her life. I'd be stupid not to. You see? I said. I know a lot of men who'd discount what she's managed to do and just ignore her. By putting her with you and George, I might be able to get us all out of here alive. He just shook his head and said, I don't like it. You don't have to like it, I said. I just need you to do it, and I need you to keep her occupied while I slip out of camp tonight and check things out and get us some extra meat. You think there's deer in these mountains? He asked. I know there are, I said. But aren't they infected or contaminated? He asked. I shook my head and said, I don't think so. The Ilus seem to go after people, not the land. But you can always skip the venison and eat the spam. He frowned at me and said, You're evil. Do you know that, Win? Actually, I'm just the opposite, I told him. He chuckled and said, Okay, you're mean. I'm a realist, I told him. First order of business is survival. After that is information, and after that, stopping the Ilu, I told him. And if that little girl gets caught up in it? He asked. Then we're 3 grown men, and we do what men are supposed to do for lost little girls. We rescue her, I told him. And when we get back to Virginia? He asked. Yeah, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. If all else fails, I'm building a new house. An extra bedroom won't be a problem. And I'm sure Jimmy's dad knows a judge or two that might be able to help get us settled. If we can't find any family, that is. You really gonna take responsibility for someone else's kid? He asked, surprised. Of course, I said. I've got the resources, and I'm damn sure not gonna leave her here to die. That is, if you and George can keep her alive through this, I said, challenging him. His eyes hardened, and he said, I'll keep her alive just to watch you saddle yourself with her. Maybe it'll settle down this need you have to solve all the world's problems. This coming from the guy who insisted on tagging along to get a piece of Jimmy's killer? I said. That's different, he protested. Right, I told him, not believing it. But it did put him in the mindset I wanted him to be in. It didn't take us long to set up shop in the Turner's old house, and I was starting to believe that my suspicions about them were right on the money. The way things were laid out, the materials used in the building of the house, and the general feel of it told me that whomever had lived here before understood at least the basics of sympathetic and associative magic. No wonder the Ilu didn't like this place. As the sun set behind the hills on the other side of the valley, where the town of Coal Creek was nestled, I could feel the minds of the Ilu reaching out to find us. They still didn't have the skull, and seemed to actually believe that I would bring it with me. My estimation of their intelligence actually went down with that, as I watched the sky turn orange and then purple, and finally a velvet of black splattered with stars. Willie came up next to me and asked, You really gonna go out there tonight? I nodded and said, Yeah. You know them things they have eyes like cats. They can see pretty good at night. I smiled and put a hand on her shoulder and said, I'm pretty good at night too. You don't act like them other city fellas, she said. You don't talk like 'em either. No, I don't, I told her. I'm probably not like any fella you've ever met."
That sounds about right,
she said. She pointed to the south where another valley intersected the one below us to the west.
"There's a shallow river that cuts through there. And there's a pond there where the deer come to drink. And if you keep following it, it'll lead you to the mine."
And she looked up at me and said,
"It was nice knowing you, mister. I already thank you for saving me today, and I hate to see you get yourself killed. But if you're going out there, I might as well tell you something that might help you."
I smiled at her and said, "I appreciate it."
"I still think you're out of your mind for wanting to go, but I can't stop you."
Just do me a favor, okay, Willie?" I asked.
"What?"
"Keep an eye on Eddie and George for me. They don't always understand how these things work," I said. She gave me a skeptical look and asked,
"And you do?"
I shrugged and replied, "More than you might think." She shrugged and replied,
"I try to keep you city boys out of mischief, but I don't think they're likely to listen to me."
"Eddie will," I told her. "If what you say makes sense, then he'll listen."
"And where are you going?"
she asked. I smiled and said, "In a little bit."
"You taking your rifle with you?"
she asked nervously. I shook my head and said, "No, I'm leaving out here for you guys to use." I stopped and asked, "Can you shoot?"
"I can usually hit what I'm aiming at," she said. "But I don't think your friends are likely to let me use a rifle."
"I just wanted to make sure that you can, if you need to, in case you have to take care of my friends," I said. She just smiled up at me. We seemed to have come to an understanding of sorts. I wasn't going to dismiss what she had to say because she was a kid, or because she was from these mountains, and she was at least going to hear me out. I think she still thought I was out of my mind, but she would at least hear me out, and that was the start. I led her back inside the house and locked the door. The smell of beans and salted pork was coming from a fireplace in the kitchen where George and Eddie were preparing dinner. George looked up and asked,
"You gonna eat before you head out?"
I shook my head and said, "No, I hum better on an empty stomach. Give my share to Willie." George smiled at me and I knew he knew what I was doing. If this turned into a siege situation, we could end up on a short rations. I'd rather take care of the kid when I could fend for myself in the forest. Well, he just shrugged and said,
"Suit yourself. You're going to anyway."
I laughed and said, "You see, you're catching on."
"Yeah,"
he told me. And there was a bit of bite in his voice when he said it.
"And we're gonna have a talk about when this problem is solved and we're back in Colonial Bay."
I knew he was chafing at me saddling him with Willie, and I knew he knew why I did it. Fine. When we get home all safe and sound then, I told him. "We're not kidding about this, Win," Eddie chimed in. I know, I told him. "I never said you had to like it. Just do it," I said.
"What are you three arguing about?"
Willie asked. And George looked at the dirty young girl and said,
"Oh, you'll find out. Anybody that Win decides is his friends or needs his help, he gets very protective of, and sometimes when they can handle themselves."
"I remember that the next time we hear a sound in my basement," I told him, reminding him of when he first found out what I was.
It can wait,"
George suddenly said. "Good," I replied. "Now you three have a super nice supper, and then make sure this door is locked and the rifle is nearby." "While you go scout the area," Eddie said. "While I go scout the area and do some hunting," I told him.
"You ain't gonna take the rifle?"
Willie asked. I shook my head and said, "No."
"Well, how you gonna kill a deer? Run it down?"
she asked skeptically. I smiled and said, "Something like that." I then slipped out the door and left the three to eat their meal. I had things to do. The Feline Factor 2. The Horned Skull. Chapter 4. Let's get straight into that. As the full moon rose over the back of the cabin, I could see quite well. Still, I needed to cover ground quickly and silently, so as soon as I entered the tree line at the edge of the property, I shifted into my tiger form and padded off into the woods, looking to find the mine. It didn't take much, skirting the guards and clearing one fence in a single bound. I made my way toward the outbuildings near the mine entrance. I could literally smell the stench of death and decay that led me past the huge piles of coal alongside the railroad tracks where trains thrummed, waiting to take their load to cities around the country. The ground was covered with debris from the spoil heap, and black dust covered the buildings that made up both the engine house for the winch and even a now seemingly unused wash house. All around me, I saw men and women and even children moving like automations as they were lowered into and out of the mine. Larger men, healthy-looking men, all with coal-black hair, made their way between the office, the workshops, and the coal yard. Letting my eyes slip into the other site, I could see a larger image beneath the one they wore. An image that was taller and bigger than I am in my human form, which is saying a lot. They moved with a purpose and a grace that spoke of a free will that was lacking in the miners I saw, and each and every one of them stank of silver. I released a low growl at that. Evidently, Lemek thought she was dealing with a weir tiger. Well, so much the better for that. She and they were going to be in for an unpleasant surprise. Shifting forms again, I became my house cat and darted behind one coal pile to the next until I was at the back side of the office. Slipping deeper into the shadows, I made my way along the crisscross support beams that held the office off the ground in case of high water, and listened carefully to the voices I heard inside the building. "Have you recovered the lost skull yet?" I heard a woman's voice ask. "Not yet, Honored One," a man replied. "And why not?" she demanded. There was a hard edge to the woman's voice. She was obviously accustomed to getting her way. "It will not matter if we complete the tunnels for travel, nor if we complete our structure in Washington on time, if we don't have the skull. Without it, we can't free those of our people that were imprisoned so long ago." "We may have another problem, Honored One," the man said carefully, as if he dreaded to deliver the bad news. "Speak," she said sharply. "There was a disturbance in town today. Our agent there swears that the songs of our jailer were sung again in town," he said. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "Greenbow, he showed up. He cast a similar spell as our ancient jailer. When the townfolk tried to detain him, he escaped with the Thomas urchin and 2 other men in a pickup truck." "Where did they go?" she asked, worry suddenly evident in her voice. "To the ridge where we dare not travel," he said. "The magics of that place still keep us out. Our scouts report that they've made camp up there." "The magic there is not strong. It's just annoying. Send 5 of your best men to take the place. Bring Greenbow to me," she said. "Honored One?" he asked. "You heard me," she said. "Bring me Greenbow and his friends." And she paused for a moment, and then added, "Especially the urchin. I want the pleasure of pouring the potion of obedience down her throat personally. I am tired of humans putting blocks in our way. We are the Yalu, the children of the sons of Yawar. They are no match for us." "Yes, Honored One," the voice said. "You said he sang the songs of Goldratir?" she asked. "That's what the shopkeeper said," he replied. "And the Jarorg we sent to deal with him were ripped apart by some beast?" Yes, Honored One, he repeated. And 2 of our own were killed in the explosion at his home? She asked. Again, yes, Honored One. And we still haven't found the skull we need, she said. No, Honored One. The human you caught it stole it. There was a tone of accusation that bordered on disgust. You will not take that tone with me, Seth, she said. I caught whom I choose. I had a need for James Babcock's services, and the dalliance was at least entertaining. There are Ilu warriors who would be more than honored to entertain you, Honored One, he asked. And of course, you're at the top of that list, she said hatefully. And there was no answer in reply. And finally, she asked, Why are you still here, Seth? Go and fetch Greenbow and his companions. I will have that skull tonight. Then, when the time is right, we will summon our brethren from their imprisonment, join with our people across the globe and rise up and take this world of our own, sweeping away mankind. Of course, Honored One, the man said. I could hear his feet stomp across the wood floor and out of the door. The stairs groaned under his weight as he descended them and then marched off towards the workshops. I had to decide, go back and protect my friends or deal with Zilla Lamech now. I had no idea what power she brought to the fight, but the ability to cloud men's mind was definitely among them. I at least had some idea of what her plans were, and I knew when I was finished here. My mother and I were going to have a long talk about what she'd done to the Ilu 1,000 years ago. I listened as Seth gathered up more Ilu and several rifles, a few boxes of ammo, and piled into one of the mine trucks. I had an idea on how to slow things down. I just had to time it right. I cut straight across the mine yard, trusting my natural camouflage and small size to protect me. When I reached the fence surrounding the yard, I switched forms and went over it. It didn't take me long to catch up with the truck on the winding roads. I waited until they were about halfway up the mountain and near one of the steep drop-offs along the side of the rutted road. I wanted to talk to Seth. I needed more information about what was going on. It wasn't above a little strong-arm tactics. As the truck made its way slowly up the hill, I climbed one of the overlooks and waited. As soon as it was about to pass under me, I leapt, landed onto the hood of the truck, made a god-awful noise and a battle cry I screamed into the night, only added to the confusion. The bed of the truck suddenly flew straight up as 1,700 pounds of Magecat landed on the front of the vehicle. The men in the back were thrown up and forward until they passed over the cab and landed in the road. And with a single punch, I reached through the windshield and grabbed Seth by the front of his shirt and pulled him out of the cab. Growling, I stepped between the truck and the embankment and ripped off the side mirror and shoved it over the edge of the cliff. It tumbled several times before finally lodging between 2 oak trees about halfway down. And still holding Seth, I slammed him around into the rock face of the embankment to stun him while I dealt with a recovering Ilu that had landed in the road. Only one of them had managed to keep his rifle, and he got off 2 shots before I was on him. I pulled my punches. I wanted these men to survive, to report back to Lamech. I was also very careful not to damage the rifle. It would make a nice addition to the Henry we had back at camp. The fight was brutal but short. Evidently the Ilu were a bit tougher than normal humans, but not that much. Again, I didn't want to kill all of them, but I wanted to make it clear to Lamech what I was going to do to her. I wanted her afraid, very afraid. I left 2 of the men a bloody mess and tossed them down the ravine. A third, I broke one of his legs and left him still conscious. The last 2, I simply roughed up a little. Okay, a lot. Then, grabbing them by the back of the neck, I shoved them back down the road towards their friend with a broken leg and growled.
Go tell your boss that I'm coming for her. And I'm going to make whatever my mother did to her look like a child's party.
One of them turned to look at me, fear showing in his coal black eyes, and asked in a voice that dripped dread.
Mother?
And I growled and said,
Samar Golstadir.
They were in such a hurry that they almost forgot to pick up their companion before they left. I really wanted them to take him with them. That would slow them down just enough for me to get the information I wanted and deal with Seth before heading back to warn the others. And turning where my prize was moaning into the side of the mountain, I growled again and grabbed him by the nape of the neck. He turned to me in terror, and I held the mirror in front of his face. The reflection was not what I had expected. The skin was a darkened, swarthy color, and the eyes were a solid black. Not a single speck of white or color to them. Small horns, maybe 3 inches long, extruded from above each eye, and his teeth were fanged, not unlike a vampire. He smelled of burning coal with a whiff of sulfur to it. I growled and said,
Now we're going to talk. More accurately, you're going to talk, and I'm going to listen.
He shook his head and looked me in the eye and said,
No, you are going to release me and come back to the mine as my prisoner.
I felt the power of his mind reach out to mine. I felt the compulsion to obey him hit me like a sledgehammer. I think I may have even stumbled back a bit impulsively. The cat in me reacted and slammed the mirror upside the side of his face, knocking him back into the side of the mountain. Thick black ichor oozed from the wound in the side of his head. I growled and said,
Don't try that again. The tiger in me doesn't like it. When my mind goes down, he takes over. You don't want him to take over.
I saw genuine fear in his eyes as he cast them down to the ground.
What do you want me to say?
Why did you kill James Babcock?
I didn't kill him, he answered. I grabbed him and slammed him against the rock wall, and with a claw of my right hand, I ripped open his coal-stained shirt to reveal the hairy chest beneath. Then I carved a rune stave into the skin and sang the runes, one by one. Again, there was a smell of burning sulfur coal as the blood oozed from his skin. He screamed the whole time I carved the rune. I got the impression that he was not accustomed to pain.
Now, why did you kill James Babcock?
I demanded as the truth spell went off.
I did not kill him. Our princess did, he said.
I growled and asked,
Zilla Lamek?
Yes. He nodded under the force of the compulsion.
What is this magic that you can compel one of the children of the sons of Yahweh? The magic of another god?
I said.
There are no other gods,
he declared. The sad part was that he actually believed that, otherwise he could not say it.
Why did Lamek kill James Babcock?
I asked.
He stole something from us, he said. I'm glad he's dead. He defiled our princess.
I laughed and said,
He took the skull?
I asked.
Yes,
he said.
He betted Lamek to do it?
I asked.
Yes.
He literally spat the word out. I had to give Jimmy credit. He not only managed to get the key to the mystery from the bad guys, but got his lance waxed at the same time as ticking off this guy.
And you wished it was you betting her?
I asked.
No, yes,
he said.
I wish it was me that she chose to grant her favors.
I shook my head and asked.
Does that mean that she's used goods now?
I asked.
Not fit for marriage, at least in your culture.
He nodded his head, but I could see the shame in his eyes.
I don't care. I would still make a respectable woman out of her, he said.
Like I'm sure that's gonna happen,
I told him. Then, grabbing his face, I pulled it around to face me and said,
Now you are going to be my messenger boy. You will return to Zilla-Lamek and tell her that the son of Samar Goldstadir is coming for her and her whole misbegotten band of slavers. When I get there, the people of Cold Creek had better be free of her control, and the mine turned back over to the humans. I will be demanding a weir guild for James Babcock, and for all the people who have died. If she cannot pay it, then her, your, and all of your people's lives are forfeit.
He looked at me and said defiantly,
I will deliver your message, but she will not agree. First, the potion of obedience is deaf to those who drink it. They cannot be returned. Secondly, she is the daughter of our king. She does not take orders. The children of the daughters of man will not be long for this earth.
Just deliver my message, wormling.
I told him as I reached above his eye and grasped at the horn there and twisted it off before shoving him away. He screamed again and reached up a hand to his head. I came back covered in the same black ichor as before. I growled and popped my claws to watch him scramble down the road.
I will be there at noon tomorrow.
She will not comply. She will destroy you if you come,
he said, limping away and trying to staunch the bleeding from his head. I looked down at the horn in my hand and smiled. It was just what I needed for a particular spell.
Then I will destroy you,
I said quietly.
I am through playing games with you people.
When he was clear of the road and out of sight, I dropped down to the truck below and took the other rifles and ammunition. If things turned badly, we were going to need them. I hid them in the high branches of a tree and then went hunting. The tiger in me was demanding no less, and I saw no reason to deny it. As soon as the moon was reaching its apex over the valley below, I stepped up and onto the front steps of the house, and with a large buck over my shoulders and 6 rifles, and pounded on the door, I yelled, "Anybody there when I help dress a deer?" As Eddie and Willie stumbled to the door with a look of surprise on their faces, I leaned the rifles against the wall and dropped the deer onto the porch. Willie looked at its torn out throat and then up at me.
How in tarnation did you kill it? It had its throat torn clean out.
Don't ask questions you don't want to know the answer to, Wilhelmina, Eddie said.
It's Willie,
she said, crossing her arms.
And I want to know.
I smiled at her and said, "My teeth."
Right,
she said.
And I'm the Queen of England.
Nice to meet you, Your Majesty, Eddie said with a smile. I always thought you were taller. She huffed and blew her hair out of her eye and marched back into the cabin, saying,
I'll get some knives.
Eddie looked at me and said, Be careful how you tease her. She may just start believing you. That might not be such a bad thing, I said, pulling the horn from my pocket.
What the?
He looked around to make sure Willie wasn't within earshot and finished.
Hell is that?
The Elu horn, I told him. I twisted it off the bastard that was leading 5 others up here to ambush you. The blood drained from Eddie's face as George finally made it over to the door.
You make a lot of noise for the middle of the night, he said. Wynn says he stopped an ambush on the cabin, Eddie said. Thought they couldn't come up here, George asked.
I shrugged and said, People who have lived here had a genuine mage talent, but they were still only mortal. The wards make the Elu uncomfortable, even cause them pain, but it doesn't stop them. They were going to fight through it to bring it down to Lamech.
How did you find out about it?
Eddie asked as Willie brought back 2 sets of knives. Looking at them appreciatively, she said,
Good steel you got here.
I smiled and said, Thanks. They were made by my mom. I tell her you approve.
Your ma works a forge?
She asked incredulously. Better than I do, I said. Then, turning to Eddie, I said, A little cat overheard her give the orders. Willie stopped and put her hands on her hips.
There was a woman come through here about 2 years ago. I had a baby with her with jet black hair. Could have sworn a couple of times I saw the cat's ears on it, a time or two. You're starting to make me worry, Mr. Greenbow. She came up here to see the Turners and then left town not long afterward. Stuff you're talking about starting to sound like witch folk stuff.
And she put her hands on her hips and asked,
You witch folk?
I smiled and said, Something like that. And she shook her head and said,
I can't say I'd turn down help from evil witch folk right now. You did me a good turn, so I ain't say nothing.
I smiled and said, I appreciate that. Then turning to her and Eddie, I asked, Can you 2 dress this thing out? I got some things I need to do before daybreak.
Such as?
Eddie asked. I smiled at Willie and reached over and plucked a hair from each of their heads and said, Witch folk stuff. I went to the truck and retrieved my hammer and a bag I kept for magical purposes. I had a couple of talismans I wanted to build, and this horn was going to be a key ingredient. I had everything I needed and was sort of blurring the line between traditional spacecraft and the more active forms of rune work. I built myself a small fire and got to work. It was going to be a busy night. By the time I was finished with the 3 small bags, I was satisfied that they would work. I sent up a brief prayer to Freya for guidance and to Thor for strength to do what I knew I was going to need to do. If what Seth had told me about the potion Lamech had used to create the Dryaug was true, and since he was still under the effect of the truth compulsion I had on him, I had no reason to believe it wasn't, and then the people of Coal Creek were lost, gone beyond my ability to save, and it was a hard lesson to learn. As I unfolded myself from where I was sitting, next to the fire, I looked up to see Willie watching me intently.
You really are witch folk, ain't you?
I smiled and motioned over to her and said, Come here.
Why?
She asked warily but walked closer. Because I need to give you something. I need you to wear it under your shirt and against your skin. As long as you don't attack the Ilu, they can't attack or hurt you.
You got 3 more of those?
She asked. I held up the other 2 and said, I have 2 of them. One for Eddie and one for George. And she nodded and asked,
You think you don't need protecting?
I laughed and said, More like I need to be free to act. I sighed deeply and said, You realize, of course, that most of the people of the town, they're gone.
I figured as much, she said. I figured as much, she said. People who pour that gunk down their throats, they don't get better.
And where does that leave you? I asked.
Standing with 3 strange men, one being a witch man, she said.
And after Lamech is gone? I asked.
Either dead or on my own, she said.
There's a 3rd option, I told her softly.
'Tis?
She asked. We'll talk about it later, I told her. But you don't have to be on your own.
Think about it,
she said, putting the small bag under her dirty shirt.
You gonna give the other 2 theirs?
I smiled and said, Yeah, and remember, as long as you don't attack the Ilu, he or she can't attack you. But if you attack one of them, then the spell is broken and they can return the favor.
Where'd y'all learn that kind of magic?
She asked. I laughed and said, Would you believe my brother?
There ain't another one like you at home?
She asked. I nodded and said, "Yep, except he's older and meaner."
"I think I'd like to meet him then," she said,
taking my hand as we headed back around to the front of the building. I could already smell the cooking steaks from inside the cabin. They didn't waste any time putting the venison to use.
"Wayne's got something for you boys,"
Willie announced as we went inside.
"Get what you wanted done?"
George asked. I did. I told him, looking at Willie.
"What do we do now?" he asked.
"First, we eat breakfast, and then we're going to take a trip I can guarantee like none you've ever taken before."
"Really?"
George asked. I smiled and said, "Yep, my sister-in-law calls it using a big hammer." I tossed him each one of the small bags and said, "Here, put these on under your shirts. As long as you wear them and don't attack any of the Ilu, they can't attack you."
"And you?"
Eddie asked. "Oh, I plan on doing a lot of attacking. I'm going to keep on attacking until they are either dead or pay the Weir Guild for Jimmy and for each and every person I've killed in Cold Creek." "We're supposed to just stand there and watch?" Eddie asked incredulously. He shook his head.
"You know, I won't do that."
"I need you to, Eddie. I need 3 witnesses for what I'm trying to do."
"Wilhelmina's just a child. She's no witness,"
George protested. "She's self-aware. That's all I need," I said.
"What game are you playing, Win?"
George asked. "The Ilu are trying to summon more of their kind into this world. They want to sweep away the sons of man. I need to get some people's attention to make sure that that doesn't happen. And to do that, you need to be a witness to the deal I'm going to strike." I stopped and said, "You may see some ugly things. You may see me do ugly things that might not sit well with what you think of a gentleman. But remember, we're not dealing with humans or even mortals here. The Ilu are a force unto themselves, and they have to be stopped." "And this just happens to keep us out of danger," Eddie said sarcastically. I smiled and said, "It does have that effect."
"You're still worried about innocents getting hurt?"
George said.
"We're not innocents."
I shook my head and said, "No, you're not. But you're still mortals and you're still my responsibility." "You're not even going to let me get a shot off at a person that killed Jimmy?" Eddie asked. I stopped him and asked, "Are you really willing to kill a woman?" Oh, that stopped him cold. He thought about it, and it finally sunk in. We were talking about killing a woman. Yeah, she was mortal, and she was a murderess dozens of times over. But there were still some lines that men of the early 20th century wouldn't cross. He looked at me and asked,
"And are you?"
"Not if she pays the Weir Guild," I said. "What's this Weir Guild thing?" Willie asked. "It's the man's price," I said. "The payment to the family and friends of the murdered. If it can be paid, then the murderer gets to go free." "Who sets the price?" Willie asked. I smiled and said, "Since I own Cold Creek Mine, and since Jimmy was a good friend of mine, I do." I paused a moment and said, "With some input from you, we can talk about it when we get there. For now, let's eat." As we settled into a breakfast of potatoes, grits, and venison steaks, I thought about the similarities of what was happening with me and what had happened on the night of the Howls. Trey had named a Weir Guild that, had the giants paid, would have turned the tide of Ragnarok. Instead, they chose to die with the blood eagle carved onto their backs. I was going to have to play my cards very well to match his deeds. After a hearty breakfast, we got things packed up and into the truck and ready to leave. Willie asked me about it.
"I thought we were getting ready to hunker down."
"Well, we were last night, but things changed when I found out what was going on. Now, we're getting ready to go out of here as fast as we can when the time comes." I took a long stick and began drawing a large circle in the dusty ground in front of the cabin. Slowly I carved the runes into the ground and filled them with the red sand from the bottles I'd brought. It was temporary and they would be burned away by the spell, but I needed a certain side effect of the spell to be magnified. Emery always said that our approach to this particular spell was to use a bigger hammer. I was counting on that.
What you doing?
Willie asked. I smiled at her and said, there is one difference between what I am and what you think of witch folk when it comes to traveling.
You can't fly,
she asked. I shook my head and said, no, I can't fly. Or I can enchant something to let me fly. No, but I can do something they can't do. And that is? Eddie asked as he checked the load in a colt he'd pulled out from behind the seat of the truck. Eddie, if you use that, then you'll lose the protection of the charm, I said. And I promise to only use it if it looks like you're losing, he said with a smile. Now, answer my question. I grinned and said, translocation.
What's that?
Willie asked. Going from one place to another without going through what it is between them, I said.
No joshing?
She said in awe. Trust me, this is going to be spectacular. And with a smile, I gestured towards the circle and said, now, if everyone will step inside and not disturb the lines, we can go.
Right now?
George asked. I looked at my watch and said, it's about 3 minutes until noon. I told her I'd be there at noon.
And we're just all gonna show up at the mine in that amount of time?
Willie asked, disbelief evident in her voice. I nodded and said, yep. And what side effect is it gonna have? Eddie asked. I smiled and said, let's just say the Coal Creek mine is not going to be under their control when I finish.
You're awful sure of yourself, Win,
George said. Would you feel better if I was nervous and worried? I asked. He shook his head and said,
no, as a matter of fact, to see you anyway, but this same frustratingly confident attitude would have me worried sick.
Exactly, I said as he stepped into the circle. I dropped the axe from my bracelet into my hand and said, Vaxa! As it grew, I sang the runes of the spell, and in a flash of lightning, we disappeared from where we had been. The Feline Factor 2. The Horned Skull. Chapter 5. Let's get straight into that. As we landed in a crash of light and sound, lightning danced all over the sky and the thunder of our arrival echoed off the mountains surrounding the mine. But the lightning and thunder didn't stop the way it usually did. Like I said, I wanted to magnify the side effects of this particular form of spell. Lightning crashed all over the mine, hitting equipment, trains, tracks, buildings, and even the mouth of the mine itself. Power surged through puddles of water, through tracks and through the metal equipment of the workshop. Ilu and Draorg alike, caught in the electrical backlash, danced as the thunder and lightning poured into the small valley like the wrath of the Thunderer himself. For several minutes, the lightning show did not let up, as it crashed constantly around us. Eddie and George made to step out of the circle that had burned itself into the ground when we landed, but I grabbed them and pulled them back. Not yet, I said over the roll of thunder. Wait until my demonstration dies down. Inside the circle, you're safe.
What the hell are you doing, Win?
George demanded.
You're gonna set the seam of coal on fire.
I nodded and grinned, saying, I know, that was part of the plan. The mine becomes useless to the Ilu. Looking over to the offices between the raised coal car tracks and the workshops, I saw the lightning blow huge holes into the side of buildings as it leapt from the tracks to the nails in the wall. They began to smoke and smoulder, but not yet burn. Then finally, the lightning storm was over, and I nodded to the others that it was okay to step outside of the circle. I believe Miss Lamech is in that direction. I pointed towards where the office was. A man opened the door and I could tell that it was Seth. I told you I would be here at noon, Seth. Several rifle shots echoed over the mountains. 3 hit me, but none touched my companions. I reached down into my shirt and pulled the hot piece of silver out of the hole and shook my head. Somebody doesn't know or understand what I am, I said with a smile. Now, please have Miss Lamech step out here. We've things to discuss. Seth was shoved aside as the leggy, dark-haired form of Zilla Lamech replaced him at the door. She had the classical good looks for a woman of this time, stacked and curved in all the right places. Her long black hair was parted on one side, much like Marlene Dietrich wore in Dishonest. There was a definite air of command about her. This was a woman who was accustomed to get in her way. She came down the steps carefully, demanding, "What have you done?" I nodded to where her shadow was directly under her in the noonday sun and said, "I've made the mine useless to you and trapped you where you can't avoid your shadow." And she looked down and froze in place. Looking up at me, I could see genuine fear in her eyes. What is it that you want?" "You've killed a lot of people, Miss Lamech. I'm here to collect the Weir Guild or your life in recompense." "I have no idea of what you're talking about." She dismissed me as another bullet bounced off my shoulder. Looking around her, she loudly demanded, "If you can't kill him, kill his companions." Again, bullets bounced around us, but none of them struck my friends. I smiled and said, "Sorry, but that won't work. Thanks for your servant, Seth. I was able to prepare something to keep them relatively safe." I approached her cautiously and asked, "Are you willing to pay the Weir Guild, or would you rather forfeit your life?" Something on the air, something about her smelled wrong. No, not wrong. It smelled different. It was a smell on women I'd occasionally encountered, and realized that, without even knowing it, she'd nearly tied my hands. She was with child. I couldn't kill her without killing the baby, and it was innocent of any wrongdoing. Moreover, it was quite possibly Jimmy's. Suddenly, 2 large, well-built Elu came charging from behind one of the coal piles with spears, the tips of which were gleaming silver in the noonday light. I shook my head and let them close. One was slightly ahead of the other, so I turned my back on the one farthest away. As the nearest one closed, I sidestepped and drove the point of the spear into the ground next to my foot. Lifting the butt of the weapon, I tossed him into the oncoming companion. I heard a satisfied thunk as the silver-headed weapon pierced in the stomach of the Elu I had thrown. He screamed once in pain as his comrade yanked the blade out and brought it back around to attack me.
"Will, look out!"
Willie yelled. I bent over backwards as the spear point made a cutting arc across the area where my chest had been earlier. As I stood up from the back bend, I stepped forward and close to the spear holder and grabbed his wrist with a quick twist and jerk. I shattered his forearm and took the weapon from him and slammed it into the coal-covered ground at my feet.
"You're gonna have to do better than that."
"Oh, I can," Lamech said. She intoned some spell. 1 word in 3 I understood, but the word Abba I recognized. Father. Suddenly, a darkness joined the white smoke that was rolling out of the mouth of the mine. Small bolts of purple and blue lightning danced inside of it as it made its way towards where we stood. In a blast of wind that pelted everyone with chunks of coal and a flash of an unclean light, a man took the form beside her. His voice boomed and echoed over the mountains.
"What have you done?"
He was tall, over 7 feet, with raven black hair that fell in a curly mass behind him. He had a thick and neatly trimmed beard of the same colour, and his swarthy skin gleamed with some oil. Black fire burned from his featureless eyes, totally obscuring them as it licked up to the edges of his face into the two great ebony horns that stuck out nearly a foot above his head. He was dressed in a short robe that tied at one shoulder and wore a baldric across the other, at the end of which hung a scabbard for a short bronze sword. His eyes scanned the coalfields and the few remaining Draorg and Elu standing. Then, looking at his daughter, he asked,
"Why have you summoned me?"
"This one has one of the skulls of our ancestors in his possession, and he refuses to return it to us. He claims to be the son of our jailer,"
Miss Lamech said with the smugness of a small child tattling about someone who had displeased her. He turned those fiery eyes on me and asked,
"Is what my daughter said true?"
I crossed my arms and said in a loud, clear voice,
"I am Wyn Greenbow, son of Robin Hunter Greenbow Jr. and Samar Goldsdottir, and I have the skull your daughter was going to use to summon your people to this world, to wipe out humanity. She has killed my friend, James Babcock, whose child she carries, has attacked my home and burned it down, has enslaved and killed the residents of the town of Cold Creek, and tried to steal my coal mine. I claim the right of Weirgild on her."
"I do not recognize the rights of pagan gods," he said, dismissing my claim.
"I will have the skull."
"No," I said. "No," he demanded, as if he was unaccustomed to being denied, his voice again booming in disbelief.
"It's a simple word with only 2 letters. Perhaps you prefer the Hebrew word, lo. Still, only 2 letters in the same meaning," I told him.
"You are impertinent, boy," he said, stepping forward. "Perhaps a bit of a lash will make you more tractable." I lowered my head and let my ears and tail pop.
Perhaps ripping off your head and using it as a chamber pot will make you understand your place, or lack thereof, in this world.
Behind me, I heard Willie take a deep breath. And stopping in his tracks, he looked at me in a bit of surprise and then seemed to come to a conclusion that I was not as dangerous as I seemed. He began to walk again and said,
"This simple werecat is no match for a king of the Elu. By taking this form, any magic you may know is denied to you."
He reached to draw his sword, and I growled. I began to sing runes as I grew to my full battle form.
"The third I know, if great need should come of a spell to stay my foes. When I sing that song, which shall blunt their swords, nor their weapons nor staves can wound."
The sword refused to leave its scabbard as he tugged on it helplessly.
"My lady told the ill father himself to use the songs as spells. Do you think she would not give her own agents the same knowledge?"
I reached across the intervening space to the now smaller man, and with a single claw etched a long, jagged line down his chest. Black ichor flowed from his body as the other Elu stepped back in shock and fear. I could see Zilla's dark eyes smolder in rage and just a touch of fear.
"I give you credit. You didn't scream like Seth did when I tore his horn from his skull."
I shook my head in frustration and said,
"This is just not going to work. What name should I carve on your headstone?"
And staggered by the fact that I not only managed to cast a spell on him, but draw first blood, I saw fear in his eyes. He stepped back and looked around at his warriors.
Will none of you rid me of this menace?
You are the one who said he would punish me,
I said.
Are you so weak that a single werecat can best you this easily?
He shook his head and said,
You are no mere werecat.
I nodded and said,
Finally, it begins to sink in. No, I am no mere werecat, as my mother was no mere North woman. I am the grandson of Jarl. I am a direct agent of the Freya, the first chooser of the battle slain, the Vanadis, and the witch that your father burned 3 times, and my blood is as noble as your own, nobler even. Now, will you pay the Weir Guild?
He stopped for a moment and considered what I said. He realized that he was not dealing with a mere witchfolk or even a lycanthrope, but something entirely new to his experience. And finally, he said,
Will you return my father's skull?
I shook my head and said,
It was a forfeit for the destruction of my home.
It was destroyed then?
He asked.
It has been neutralized. You cannot reach it, and its power is contained for the next several thousand years.
I said,
It is no longer in this world.
What have you done?
He demanded. I smiled and said,
I figured my mother should have something to recompense for her trouble, to which she had to go to banish you from this land.
He nodded his head and said,
Then we are even. We now walk this land, and you have the means by which you would increase our host.
Not quite,
I said.
The skull covers the damage you have done to my home, not the lives of my friends and those who depended on the mine your daughter tried to steal from me.
I tire of this, he said. Name your price and it will be paid.
I smiled and asked,
And you agree to be bound by this price?
Yes, he said. Name your price so we can move on.
I know that I cannot deny you access to Earth for what you've done, but I would deny you access to this land. You nor yours may not set foot on the shores of this continent for as long as the United States stands as a sovereign nation. You are not denied your access to Europe, Asia, or anywhere else in the world, but all Ilu will stay out of the United States. That is my price for trying to steal my land.
You name a high price, the king demanded.
I am only just beginning,
I said.
Otherwise, your life and the life of your daughter are forfeit. You know I can follow you, and you have no power to stop me.
I looked to where the mine was behind them and was beginning to collapse.
I have ignited the coal seam. Make a decision quickly, otherwise you will be stuck here, and I will have to take your lives.
He looked back worriedly and said,
Very well. You have my word that no Ilu will step foot within the boundaries of this land, as long as it remains a sovereign nation. Now, what is your final demand?
I looked over to his daughter and realized that demanding her life would kill Jimmy's unborn child, and I wouldn't do that. As an agent of a living goddess, I could not bring myself to demand the death of an innocent unborn.
Upon the birth of Zilla's child, you will deliver it to the dwarves of Swathheim, who will then in turn deliver it to me, and I will give it to James's family.
And Zilla's life? He asked.
If you do this, then I will not demand her life for James,
I said.
Wait a minute, Eddie suddenly protested. She gonna get away with murdering Jimmy?
I chuckled and said,
No, she won't. She will be dishonored, As far as the other Alu are concerned, she is no better than a whore now.
I could see the anger in the king and his daughter smouldering in their eyes as my words struck home. You know us well. I laughed and didn't tell him any different. I just knew what the ancient Jewish patriarchs were like and how they viewed fallen women. The Judeo-Christian tradition was only just now starting to view women as a whole, as human beings. And the Islamic sect was still in the 7th century on the subject. I figured that the Ilu, descended from the people who would become the Jews, would not have changed their attitudes that much. Civilizations that become isolated tend to become backwards.
Do we have a deal?
Again, I looked knowingly at the mine behind me.
As for the lives of the people of Cold Creek you've taken, you will instruct your human agents on Earth, who are authorized to do so, to sign over all of Zilla's and the Alu's holdings on this continent to Wilhelmina Thomas.
You would make that wild urchin one of the richest women in the world.
Why not? You no longer have use for the property, and she is the only survivor of the town.
I grinned and leaned my axe against the ground and said,
Eldrila!
The weapon suddenly ignited and began to burn the coal around it. The king finally nodded and said, And this will be done with our bargaining?
Your name and your word will close the negotiations,
I said smugly. Again, the Ilu looked at me and Zilla asked, Why do you demand his name? What magic would it give you over him? I shook my head and said,
No magic, but I need the name to know who to invoke if you step out of line. I need the name for the songs that the elves will sing about my victory this day.
That's rather conceited, isn't it, Win?
George asked.
I am the grandson of a Jarl. I will not hide my deeds behind some false pretense of humility. People of this reality may not know of them, but the people of my mother's home will know of them and sing of the second defeat of the sons of Yawar.
Who is this Yawar you keep talking about?
Willie demanded.
Jehovah,
George said.
Win is claiming victory over the children of angels who took humans' wives in Genesis.
The king suddenly looked stricken as he kept glancing back at the burning mine.
Very well. My name is Beni Elohim, and I agree to your terms. It shall be done as you demand.
I growled and looked at George, Eddie and Willie and asked,
Do you three acknowledge and witness the deal struck here today?
Yeah, George said sadly.
I know what was said,
Eddie replied sullenly.
I heard you. I didn't understand half of it, but I heard you,
Willie said. I turned back to Bene Elohim and said,
Then the deal is struck and sealed.
Struck and sealed,
he replied. I turned to the mine and sang another of the songs of Odin to dampen the fire.
You may return to your people. I will hold down the flames until you are gone.
This is not over,
Zilla said. I hope not, Eddie replied angrily. You're getting away with murder.
Is it murder to squash a bug? She asked.
Do you want to find out?
I asked her. Quiet, daughter, Bene Elohim said. We have much to discuss. You have dishonored our family, yourself and your mission. You have brought shame on us and have reinforced the chains placed on us by this man's family. Only the deal we have struck to see that this James man's child is given up as a hostage keeps me from killing you here and now for your sins. You have 9 months to convince me to change my mind about later. Then they disappeared as a rolling shadow back into the mine. I shrank down to my human self and looked at Eddie and said, You see, she's not getting away with murder. Very possibly as soon as Jimmy's son or daughter is turned over to me, her own father may kill her for dishonoring her family.
That's why you changed your mind? You never intended to kill her today, did you?
George asked. I shook my head and said, not when I found out that she was carried a child. I sighed and said, I won't take an innocent life, no matter what the sins of the father or the mother. And what if Jimmy's folks won't take the baby? Eddie demanded. Then that's just another room in my new home. I smiled and said, but somehow I think the Babcocks will be glad to have their grandchild.
And it will be half a Lou? George asked. What does that mean?
It means that if it's a boy, he'll be a better basketball player than Johnny, I told him. Probably, even if it's a girl.
Really?
George asked. I laughed and said, how should I know? You don't get half of a person. You get the people with different bloodlines, but they are still whole people. Will he or she inherit his mother's gifts? Possibly. Probably, even. But he can be taught to use those to help instead of hurt. Are they demons? Willie asked. Who? I asked her. The Yalu, she said. I shook my head and said, no, they're descended from naughty angels, not fallen ones. Naughty angels? Eddie asked incredulously. That's not a term which I'm entirely comfortable. I just smiled and turned back to the mine and released the spell that was holding back the flames. George stepped beside me and said,
You just lost a fortune here, Win. This mine was valuable, even under normal circumstances.
I shook my head and said, perhaps, but I think it would be best if it was left alone. I let the dead here rest in peace. He shook his head again and said,
You are one queer man, Win Greenbow.
You have no idea, I said.
So you keep saying, he replied, and I have to admit you keep proving it as well.
He stopped to think about something I'd said and then asked,
I thought you said your parents were dead.
I shook my head and said, my parents and I can only visit each other in the land of Alfs, usually on our high holy days, until my mission here is completed and they have to do things they must do. Contact with them is difficult and they may not come here, and I may not go to where they are until we all three are finished. And exactly what is your mission here? Eddie demanded as he put an arm around Willie's shoulder. To stand between humanity and those that were free and chained, I told him. That's rather vague, Eddie said. I shook my head and said, no, that's quite clear. Protect those who can't protect themselves and keep mankind free of the influence of evil creatures. Like the Yalu? Willie asked. I shook my head and said, like Zilla, not the Yalu as a whole. Like I said, they're not descended from the fallen angels, just angels who bend the rules. They feel like they've got on the raw end of the deal, and I can't really blame them for that. But instead of trying to live peacefully with mankind, they keep trying to conquer mortals. You toss that word around like it doesn't apply to you, Eddie said. I'm mortal. I can be killed. It just takes a whole lot more than anything Bene, Elohim, or even a recondite order can bring to bear. And I have a specific weakness, but I won't tell anyone what it is. What about me? Willie asked. You neither, I said. No, I mean, what do you think you're going to do about me? I shrugged and said, first off, we're all going to get out of this area. I'm going to cast a bit of magic to hide it so those that were here can rest in peace, and then we're all going back to Colonial Bay. After I get all the legal things taken care of then I need to. Then, I think maybe, I'm going to let you spend some time with my grandmother. She's very good with young girls who can take care of themselves. She, after all, raised my mum. After that, we'll see. I looked her in her eye and said, I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Willie. I'm not wearing no dress, she said, crossing her arm and pouting. Have I said anything about a dress yet? I asked.
That's the yet part that's bothering me.
Wise girl, I said. But for right now, let's take care of what needs to be done. And so it was done. I got the valley sealed. Mr. Babcock was very helpful in getting the legal aspects of the situation cleared for both myself and Willie. And Jimmy's former employers were quite happy to take on the job of constructing a home we designed a little further out, on the point to where it overlooked the bay. And, with a great deal of patience on my grandmother's end, I suspect, my mother's part, Willie got a little more tame. I was very careful approaching the Babcocks about the subject of Jimmy's son. After filling them out on the issue for several weeks, I finally broke the news to them that they had a grandchild on the way, and that he, or she, was going to need a home. They were thrilled that there was at least some part of him to live on. Even though they were getting up in their years, they were willing to take on the responsibility of raising him or her, and, much to my surprise, named me as the godfather. Almost 9 months to the day, I delivered them a bouncing baby girl, with a shock of black hair and eyes as blue as their son's. She was a bit colicky at first, but it didn't take long for them to fall in love with a granddaughter, whom they called Rosemary. I got the feeling that, had Rosemary been a boy, then I might have had more of a fight on my hands from Bene Elohim. But he had enough daughters to take care of, as it was. It was 18 months later when I moved into my new home on Swan Point. In the tradition of all great southern homes, I gave it a name, of course, Summer Home. I thought my mother would appreciate it. It was huge. It was made of granite quarried from Massachusetts and hardwood from West Virginia. And there were plenty of rooms for me to entertain and, of course, for my friends to visit, and a boat dock out back. And like my ancestors of old, I planned on taking up sailing and purchased a small yacht for that purpose. It was time that I took Hild's words to heart and started living like a grandson of a Jarl. A year after Summer Home was built, a 14-year-old Willie arrived at Alfheim. My grandmother and mother both telling me that I had taken responsibility for her and that they had done what they could do to tame her, but she was now mine to look after. I simply smiled at them and thanked them for their efforts. She had been cleaned up and taught to take care of herself. Her blonde hair had been washed and trimmed, and she was wearing shoes, something my mother told me was more of a difficult feat than getting her into the simple velvet dress she wore to the Yuletide celebrations at my grandfather's. I informed Mr. Babcock of the arrival of my ward, and he suggested several local private schools appropriate for a young lady of means. Willie fought me on it, but we decided on one that was local and did not require her to board there. My life had suddenly become so much more complicated. Anyone who asked was told that she was my cousin and that we were the only family either had left around here. It would seem that my mother had taught her more than what was just needed to be a young lady. She had also begun to teach her spay work, and she had a genuine gift for it. A larger house meant more staff, and that meant that I was able to hire Mrs. McCain and put her in charge of the kitchen staff, and her husband became responsible for the grounds. George appreciated my helping to take care of his aunt and uncle, and it gave the living arrangements an air of respectability. Nobody would dare make an untoward insinuations about Willie living with me, with Mrs. McCain there to set them straight. Willie, on the other hand, began to thrive and proved to have a quick mind and a love of learning. But the wild side of her was never quite tamed. It wasn't unusual for me to find her sitting out on the pier or the boat dock and with a fishing line in the water and the latest issue of Doc Savage magazine concealed behind a copy of a fashion magazine. When I'd call her out on it, all she'd do is pitch her voice into the same tone as my mother's and say, "We must keep up appearances." And then we both laugh like we were mad, and for a few moments all would be right in our world. And thus it remained, until I was once again called to deal with a threat to humanity beyond the abilities of humankind. Wow. Certainly, 100% another one. Wow. Absolutely thrilling and intriguing tapestry of horror and adventure there from the incredible mind of my good friend Wayne Harbison. Of course, a huge thank you to Wayne once again for all of his support and friendship on and off the show. It really is appreciated, and as always, I can't wait to see what else is around the corner with your incredible stories. Guys and girls, of course, I've left a link in the description box which will take you straight over to Wayne's Amazon bookstore. There you can find all of Wayne's work, including the stories that we've actually covered already on the show, and plus a few that are yet to be narrated. Why not treat yourself, or possibly that DMT fan or Wayne Harbison fan in your life, to something wickedly horrifying this Christmas? If you're an aspiring writer, or would just like to have a crack at things, why not get in touch with myself at the usual email as on screen, which is dmtforestofear@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. Of course, as ever, I hope everybody's well and happy as can be during these testing times, and you're trying to keep fit and focused. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.